Hey there and welcome back. I hope you are somewhere warm tonight. Wherever you are, in bed already, or on your way there, or just settled in for a quiet evening, let me invite you to do nothing more difficult than to keep listening, or to half listen, or to drift away into sleep whenever sleep wants to find you. Let your shoulders soften. Let your jaw unclench. Let the small, persistent thoughts of the day drift away from you, one at a time. Tomorrow will arrive in its own time, with whatever it brings. For now, you can put it down. The day is over. The night is yours. Tonight's story is about a marriage, a long royal marriage, lasting 44 years, between two people who never quite felt the same way about each other. There are romantic versions of this story. The true story is different. It is sadder, more complicated, more asymmetric. He loved her with unmistakable patient devotion throughout the marriage. She loved him in some other, more complicated way that the surviving evidence does not quite resolve. That asymmetry is the heart of what we are going to look at tonight. I want to start tonight with a question. Not a question that has a clear answer, but a question worth sitting with for a few hours in the slow and patient way that the best questions deserve to be sat with. Did the Empress love her husband? The Empress is Elizabeth. Her family called her Sisi. She was born in Bavaria in 1837, and she married the Emperor of Austria Franz Joseph I in April of 1854, when she was 16 years old. By the standards of every measure that the 19th century had for such things, she was one of the most beautiful women in Europe, with extraordinary brown hair that fell past her ankles when it was loose, and a face that has been painted and photographed and described by an enormous number of artists and writers, none of them quite able to capture exactly what her contemporaries thought they saw when they looked at her. She lived a strange and difficult life. In many respects, she was assassinated in Geneva in September of 1898, when she was 60 years old, by a young Italian anarchist who had wanted to kill someone of higher standing than himself and had found her on the lakeside that day instead. The husband is Franz Joseph. He was 8 years older than her, and he had been the Emperor of Austria since 1848, when he was 18, having been installed on the throne by his family during the revolutions of that year when his uncle was persuaded to abdicate. He ruled for 68 years, one of the longest reigns in European history, presiding over a multi-ethnic empire that stretched from the Alps to the Carpathians and from the Adriatic to the borders of Russia. He outlived his wife by 18 years. He outlived his only son by 27. He outlived his nephew and chosen heir by 2. He died in November of 1916, in the middle of the First World War, which would destroy the empire he had spent his entire life preserving. By every measure that the 19th century had for an emperor, he was the model of his kind. Dutiful, punctual, unimaginative, devoted to his work to the exclusion of almost everything else, except, perhaps, his wife. Did she love him? It is a question that biographers and historians have been arguing about for over a century now, and the answer is not simple. He certainly loved her. There is no real doubt about that. The letters he wrote to her throughout the 44 years of their marriage when she was far away, which she usually was, are some of the most consistent expressions of devotion that any 19th century imperial figure produced. They are not great love letters in the literary sense. He was not a literary man. They are the patient, repeated, unself-conscious letters of a man writing to the woman he genuinely cared about, telling her about his day, asking after her health, hoping she would come back soon, and ending always with some affectionate phrase that he had been using since the early years of their marriage. He called her his angel. Letters survive in considerable numbers in the archives that the imperial family preserved, and they have been studied carefully by various historians over the past 100 years. What emerges from the careful study is, more than anything else, the consistency of his feeling for her. The early letters of their engagement in 1853 and 1854 are warm and devoted in the way that newly engaged correspondence often is. The letters of the first years of their marriage are similar, with the small differences in tone that the establishment of an actual marriage produces. The letters of the difficult middle years when she was travelling and he was alone in Vienna retain the same warmth, the same care, the same consistent affection. The letters of the late years, after mailing and through the last decade of her life, continue to express the same feelings, undiminished by the years of separation and the various difficulties that the marriage had been through. There is, across the entire 44 years of correspondence, no real falling off in the depth of his expressed feeling for her. The man who was writing these letters in 1898, just before her death, was the same man who had been writing them in 1854, with the same feelings and the same patient persistence. She, on her side, wrote back. She wrote back with affection, but the letters she wrote, and the poems she composed for him over the years, and the various accounts that the people closest to them have left, suggest something more complicated than a simple matching love. She seems to have cared for him, in her way. She seems to have been grateful for his patience with her, and she certainly relied on him for the freedom and the resources that his unconditional support gave her. But the question of whether she loved him in the same way that he loved her, with the same intensity and the same daily presence in her thoughts, is a question that the surviving evidence leaves genuinely open. She travelled, increasingly through her later years, for months at a time, leaving him alone in Vienna with his work. She built herself a palace on the island of Corfu, where she could be away from the court entirely. She wrote poetry in long manuscript volumes that imagined her as a wandering soul, attached to no fixed place, free of the obligations that her marriage had placed on her. She seems, in the surviving record, to have spent much of her adult life trying to be somewhere else and someone else than the woman who had married Franz Joseph in 1854. So the question is genuine: did she love him? Or, and this is the possibility that I find most interesting, did she love him in a way that the simple word love does not quite capture, with a complicated mixture of affection and obligation and resentment and gratitude that has no clean name in any language? I do not have an answer to give you tonight. I will not be telling you, at the end of our story, that she did or did not love him. The honest scholarly answer to the question is that it is not clear, and that the evidence supports several different readings, and that the truth was probably some particular combination of feelings and circumstances that neither of them fully articulated even to themselves. What I can do tonight is walk you through the story of their marriage, slowly, from the beginning to the end, and let you sit with the question yourself, and form your own sense of what was happening between these two particular people across the 44 years that they were together. By the end of the evening, you will know enough about both of them to have your own sense of what the answer might be. And if you have drifted off into sleep before we get to the end, that is also fine, because the question will still be there in the morning if you want to come back to it. Let me begin, then, in Vienna. Specifically in Vienna in the early 1850s, when our story properly opens, when Franz Joseph was 23 and unmarried, and when his mother, the Archduchess Sophie, was beginning the work of finding him a suitable wife. Vienna in 1853 was the capital of the Austrian Empire, which was at that moment one of the great powers of Europe. The empire was a vast multi-ethnic state, ruled from Vienna by the Habsburg dynasty, which had been on the imperial throne in various forms since the 13th century. The empire included the German-speaking Austrians, the Czechs and Slovaks of Bohemia and Moravia, the Poles and Ruthenians of Galicia, the Hungarians and the various peoples who lived under the Hungarian crown, the Croats and Slovenes of the south, the Italians of Lombardy and Venetia, and various other smaller nationalities scattered through the empire's territory. The whole was held together by the imperial government in Vienna, by the Catholic Church, by the German-speaking bureaucracy, by the imperial army, and by the deep traditional loyalty that the Habsburg family had cultivated over 6 centuries of rule. Vienna itself was, in 1853, a city of perhaps 600,000 people, with the medieval inner city still surrounded by its old walls and the suburbs spreading out beyond. It would be only a few years later, in 1857, that Franz Joseph would order the demolition of the city walls and the creation of the Ringstrasse, the great boulevard that would replace them and that would become, over the decades that followed, one of the most distinctive architectural achievements of any 19th century European city. But in 1853, the walls were still there. The city was still organized around the medieval pattern that had been preserved through the centuries. The Hofburg, the imperial palace in the center of the inner city, was a sprawling collection of buildings of different periods, with the imperial family living in some sections and the various offices of the imperial government occupying others. The Hofburg itself deserves a brief description because it was the central physical location of so much of what we are about to discuss. The palace had been the seat of the Habsburg family for centuries, growing through successive additions and modifications until, by the middle of the 19th century, it occupied a large irregular complex of buildings in the heart of the inner city. The various sections had been built in different periods, in different architectural styles, and they were connected to each other by a complicated network of courtyards, passages, and corridors that visitors found bewildering on first encounter. The imperial family lived in the various private apartments scattered through the complex, with each generation occupying its own particular sections. The senior household offices were located in other sections. The various ceremonial rooms used for the formal events of the court calendar were distributed through the complex according to their particular functions. The whole arrangement had grown organically rather than being designed, and it gave the Hofburg the character of an institution as much as a building, with its various parts having developed their own histories and their own traditions over the centuries. In the warmer months of the year, the imperial family generally moved out of the Hofburg to the suburban palace of Schönbrunn, a few miles to the west of the inner city. Schönbrunn had been built in the late 17th and early 18th centuries as a summer residence in conscious imitation of the French royal palace at Versailles. It was a great yellow palace, set in formal gardens that stretched up the hillside behind it, with a small zoo, an extensive park, and various other amenities that the imperial family used for relaxation and entertainment. The summer life at Schönbrunn was less formal than the winter life at the Hofburg, with the protocol relaxed and the daily schedule simplified, although the differences were relative rather than absolute, and the imperial life remained, in either residence, an enormously formal and demanding existence. The court of Franz Joseph in 1853 was governed by an etiquette that had been formalized in the 16th century, in the time of the Habsburg connection with Spain, and that was, by 1853, considered the most rigid and the most elaborate court etiquette anywhere in Europe. The Spanish court etiquette, as it was called, prescribed every aspect of life at the Habsburg court, from the precise order of precedence at any function, to the particular forms of address that were required for each rank, to the specific ceremonies that had to be performed at every meal and every audience and every formal occasion. The etiquette was the work and the obsession of the various senior officers of the court, particularly the Obersthofmeister, the head chamberlain, who was responsible for the management of the entire household. To live at the Habsburg court was to live within this elaborate set of rules, with the smallest deviation from them being noticed and discussed and, often, corrected. Presiding over all of this, in 1853, was the figure of Archduchess Sophie. She was Franz Joseph's mother, and she was, by general agreement, the most powerful woman in the empire. She had been born a Bavarian princess, the daughter of King Maximilian I of Bavaria, and she had married Archduke Franz Karl of Austria in 1824. Franz Karl was a younger son of the imperial family, not expected to inherit, and Sophie had spent the early years of her marriage in a relatively comfortable but politically marginal position. The events of 1848, however, had changed everything. The revolutions of that year had thrown the empire into chaos, and the imperial family had decided that the existing emperor, Ferdinand I, was not capable of managing the crisis. Sophie had taken the leading role in arranging Ferdinand's abdication and the accession of her own son, Franz Joseph, who was only 18 at the time. From 1848 onward, Sophie was the power behind the throne in Vienna. She managed her son. She advised him on his political decisions. She supervised his marriage prospects. She cultivated the network of imperial relationships across Europe that the Habsburg family depended on. She was by every account an intelligent and forceful woman, with a clear sense of what she thought the empire needed, and a willingness to push her son in the direction she thought best. Her son, who had inherited his father's quiet and somewhat passive temperament, along with his mother's sense of duty, generally deferred to her in these matters, particularly in the early years of his reign. By 1853, Sophie had decided that it was time for Franz Joseph to marry. He was 23. The empire needed an heir. The political importance of a suitable imperial match could not be neglected. Sophie had a particular candidate in mind, her own niece, the daughter of her sister Ludovica, who had married Duke Maximilian of Bavaria. The niece was named Helene, called Nene by the family, and she was 18 years old in 1853, 2 years younger than her sister Elizabeth, called Sisi, who was 15. Sophie had been considering Helene for some time, and had communicated through the family channels that the meeting between Helene and Franz Joseph should be arranged. The plan was that Franz Joseph and Helene would meet in August 1853 in the small spa town of Bad Ischl in Upper Austria, where the imperial family customarily spent the late summer. The meeting would be informal, presented as a family gathering, but the understanding among the senior members of the family was that an engagement would follow if the young people seemed compatible. Sisi, the younger sister, was included in the trip almost as an afterthought. She was 15 years old. She was the second daughter of the Bavarian house, less formally educated than her older sister, less polished, less obviously suited for an imperial marriage. She had grown up in a relatively informal household, with her parents travelling frequently and the children being given considerable freedom in the family's various Bavarian residences. She was a country girl in many respects, more comfortable on horseback in the mountains than in the formal drawing rooms of the imperial court. She was extraordinarily beautiful, even at 15, with the long dark hair that would become famous, and the slim figure, and the particular quality of presence that her contemporaries noticed but could not quite describe. Helene was the candidate. Sisi was just along for the visit. What happened at Bad Ischl in August of 1853 is one of the most famous moments in 19th century royal history, and it has been told and retold in so many forms over the centuries that it has become difficult to recover the actual events from the layers of romanticization that have accumulated over them. But the basic facts, as best we can determine them from the surviving sources, are these. Bad Ischl itself was a small spa town in the Salzkammergut region of Upper Austria, set among the lakes and mountains that the imperial family had favoured for summer holidays since the middle of the 18th century. The town was modest by imperial standards, with perhaps 2,000 inhabitants and a small collection of villas and hotels that catered to the imperial visitors and their entourages. The imperial family stayed at the Kaiser Villa, a comfortable but unpretentious residence on the edge of town, with views of the surrounding hills and access to the walks and rides that the imperial party enjoyed during their summer visits. The atmosphere of Bad Ischl was deliberately less formal than the imperial life of Vienna, with the etiquette relaxed and the ceremonies reduced, and the imperial family living something closer to the kind of life that ordinary aristocratic families lived in their country houses. The Bavarian family arrived at Bad Ischl on the evening of the 17th of August. They were tired from the journey, which had taken several days from Munich by various combinations of carriage and train. The various luggage trunks had been delayed somewhere on the route, and the formal clothes that Helen was supposed to wear for the first meeting had not yet arrived. The mother, Ludovica, was distressed about the situation. She had spent months preparing Helene for this exact moment. and the absence of the proper clothes was, in her view, a serious problem. The two sisters, Helene and Sisi, were both wearing simpler travelling dresses that they had not had time to change, with the dust of the road still on their boots and their hair somewhat disordered from the long carriage journey. Helene, in this disadvantaged condition, was nervous and somewhat withdrawn. She had been the prepared candidate for years. She knew on this particular evening that the meeting that was about to take place would determine the shape of the rest of her life. She did not have her formal clothes. She did not have time to refresh herself. She felt, by all surviving accounts of her own state of mind, distinctly unprepared for the moment that was about to arrive. Sisi, by contrast, had no such concerns. She was not the candidate. She was just along for the visit. She had nothing in particular to lose. She could be herself in the simple and direct way that her own personality permitted, without the pressure that her sister was operating under. Franz Joseph, who had arrived in Bad Ischl earlier in the day with his mother, came over to the family's hotel that evening to greet his cousins. He was 23. He was the most eligible young man in Europe, in the formal political sense of the phrase. He was tall, slim, with the dark blonde hair and the long sideburns that would become his trademark in his later years. He was, by the standards of his class, a handsome young man, although not extraordinarily so. He had been told that he would be marrying Helen. He had agreed, in the way that young Habsburg princes agreed to marriages that their families had arranged for them, without much enthusiasm, but without any particular resistance. He had not seen Helene since they had been children together, and he had no particular sense of what to expect from her as a grown woman. He saw Sisi before he saw Helene. The room at the hotel was crowded with family members, with Ludovica and the various other Bavarian relatives all gathered to welcome the imperial visit, and Sisi happened to be standing closer to the door, and Franz Joseph's eye fell on her first. By all accounts, including those of the various witnesses who left written records of the moment, he was immediately and visibly struck by her. He could not look away from her. He kept finding excuses to talk to her rather than to her sister. He danced with her at the small informal ball that was held the following evening. He took the next available opportunity to speak privately with his mother and to inform her that he had decided to marry Sisi rather than Helene. What was it, exactly, that struck him? The question is interesting, because Sisi at 15 was not yet the famous beauty that she would later become. She was tall, with the long brown hair that would become legendary, but the famous slimness was not yet so pronounced, and the careful adult presentation that she would later cultivate had not yet developed. She was in 1853 a young girl, with the awkwardness and the unself-consciousness that 15-year-old girls often have. What seems to have struck Franz Joseph was, by the various accounts, precisely this unself-consciousness, the sense that she was not performing for him in the way that Helen was performing, that she was simply herself in a way that the more prepared and more anxious Helene was not. She had a kind of natural directness. She laughed at things that struck her as funny, in a way that was unusual at a court meeting. She rode well on the horseback excursions that the imperial party made together over the next 2 days, with a confidence that even Franz Joseph, an experienced rider, recognized as exceptional. She was, in some way that the surviving accounts cannot quite specify, alive in a way that the more carefully prepared candidates often were not. Sophie was, by all accounts, taken aback by this development. She had spent years preparing the ground for the match with Helene. She knew Helene to be more formally educated, more politically aware, more obviously suited for the demands of an imperial marriage. She tried, in the way that she had been able to influence her son on so many other matters, to redirect him back to the original plan. She pointed out the practical difficulties of the change. She raised concerns about Sisi's age, her education, her preparation for the role. She suggested that her son was being romantic in a way that the realities of his position did not permit. He did not, this time, defer to her. He insisted, with a quiet firmness that was not characteristic of him, that he would marry Sisi. Sophie, after some discussion, gave way. She had spent enough time managing her son to know when his mind was genuinely made up, and on this matter, it was made up. She accepted the change of plan, and she set about adjusting her preparations to accommodate the substitution of one sister for the other. She's that teacher. The engagement was announced at a family dinner on the 19th of August. Just 2 days after the Bavarian family had arrived, Sisi, who had been in Bad Ischl for less than 48 hours, found herself engaged to be married to the Emperor of Austria. She was 15 years old. She had not been raised for this. She had not been prepared for it. She had not even been aware, until that morning, that she was going to be the candidate. Her older sister Helene, who had been preparing for years for exactly this moment, was suddenly without a future, with her younger sister taking the position that had been intended for her. The whole arrangement of the family, in the space of 2 days, had been turned upside down by Franz Joseph's sudden decision. Helene, by all accounts, behaved with remarkable dignity in the immediate aftermath of the change. She did not complain. She did not show resentment toward her sister. She did, by the various private accounts that have survived, weep in private, but she did not allow her grief to become a public matter. She would, eventually, marry the hereditary Prince of Thurn-on-Taxis in 1858, and would have a happy though shortened marriage, with her husband dying after only 9 years and Helen living on as a widow until 1890. The marriage to the prince was a respectable one, but it was not the imperial throne that she had been prepared for, and the disappointment of August 1853 stayed with her in muted form for the rest of her life. The various accounts of how Sisi felt about all of this in those first days are mixed. The sentimental tradition has it that she was as struck by Franz Joseph as he was by her, and that the two of them had fallen instantly in love. The more skeptical scholarly tradition has it that she was bewildered by the speed of events, that she was flattered by the attention of the most eligible young man in Europe, and that she did not really understand what she had agreed to. The truth is probably somewhere between these two readings. She seems to have liked Franz Joseph on first acquaintance. He was a handsome young man, courteous and gentle in his manner, clearly devoted to her, treating her with a kind of tender attention that was intoxicating to a 15-year-old girl who had not previously been the object of such concentrated focus. But she does not seem, from the surviving evidence, to have understood what marrying him would mean. She did not understand the court she was about to enter. She did not understand the role she was being asked to play. She did not understand fundamentally that she was being removed from one life and placed into another, and that the transition would be much harder than the romance of the first week suggested. The engagement period lasted from August 1853 until the wedding in April 1854, 8 months, during which Sisi remained in Bavaria with her family, while the elaborate preparations for the imperial marriage were being made in Vienna. There was a substantial program of education that had to be undertaken to bring her up to the level of cultural and political knowledge that an Empress of Austria was expected to possess. She had to learn the various languages of the empire, beginning with formal High German rather than the Bavarian dialect she had grown up with, and continuing into Hungarian, Czech, French, and Italian. She had to learn the elaborate court etiquette that would govern her daily life. She had to learn the names and the relationships of the various senior figures in the imperial court, and the proper forms of address for each. She had to study the history of the empire and the genealogy of the imperial family. The educational program, by the standards of what a young noblewoman of her time would normally have undertaken, was enormous, and Sisi, by all accounts, struggled with it. She was an intelligent girl, but she had not been trained in academic discipline, and the sudden imposition of so much demanding intellectual work was difficult for her. The tutors who were sent from Vienna to manage her education varied in their effectiveness. The German tutor, an elderly professor from the Imperial University, was patient and methodical, but somewhat dry in his approach. The French tutor was warm and engaging, but kept disagreeing with the etiquette tutor about which forms of polite address were correct. The history tutor, who was supposed to teach her the genealogy of the Habsburgs, presented the material in such an exhaustively detailed way that Sisi sometimes wept from the sheer volume of names and dates she was supposed to memorize. The etiquette tutor, the Countess Esterhazy, who would later become her senior lady-in-waiting in Vienna, was the most demanding of all, with detailed instructions on every aspect of imperial behavior that the young Sisi found bewildering and oppressive. By the end of the 8 months, Sisi had absorbed some of the material, but by no means all of it, and she would arrive in Vienna with significant gaps in her preparation that the imperial court would notice and comment on. She also had to be physically prepared. The clothes, the jewels, the trousseau in general that an imperial bride was expected to bring with her, all of this had to be assembled and prepared. The Bavarian court tailors and seamstresses worked for months on the various dresses and accessories. The imperial gifts that had been sent by Franz Joseph and his family, including the famous Habsburg pearls and various other jewels that had been in the Habsburg family for centuries, had to be received and acknowledged. The portraits that were commissioned of Sisi by the various court painters, intended to communicate her appearance to the senior figures of the empire who had not yet met her, had to be sat for and approved. Through all of this, she wrote letters to Franz Joseph, and her, and the correspondence of those 8 months gives us our first sustained look at the dynamics of their relationship. His letters were warm, devoted, almost worshipful, addressed to his angel and his beloved one and his future wife. He wrote to her every few days, sometimes every day, with detailed accounts of his own activities and his own feelings. He told her how much he was looking forward to seeing her again. He described in some detail the apartments at the Hofburg that were being prepared for her arrival. He sent her small gifts, with each gift accompanied by a long letter explaining what the gift meant and why he had chosen it. The letters were not the work of a great romantic writer. They were, instead, the work of a young man in love, writing without literary self-consciousness to the woman he was about to marry, with the simple sincerity that was characteristic of him throughout his life. Her letters were more reserved, more polite, more conventionally affectionate, with the kind of careful courtliness that a young girl writing to her future husband under the supervision of her mother might be expected to produce. She wrote less frequently than he did. She wrote shorter letters. She used the conventional forms of address and the conventional phrases of affection. She thanked him for his gifts. She told him about her education and her preparations. She closed with the proper expressions of regard. The letters are, by any reasonable reading, the letters of a young girl trying to do the right thing in a difficult situation, rather than the letters of a young woman in love. The asymmetry was already visible in those first letters between the depth of his feeling and the more contained quality of hers. Some of the more candid surviving accounts of her state of mind during those 8 months come from her younger sister, who later wrote about Sisi's mood as the wedding approached. Sisi, by these accounts, became increasingly anxious as the date got closer. She slept badly. She ate little. She wept on several occasions in private about the future that was approaching. She wrote in her diary the occasional line of poetry that survives from this period, and the lines are uniformly somber, with the imagery of cages and chains and lost freedom dominating the brief verse. She was, by any honest reading, dreading the wedding, even as she went through the various preparations for it. She was 15, then 16, and she did not know how to refuse what was coming, and she would not have refused it even if she had known how. But she also did not want it, in the simple way that a young person cannot want something that is being arranged for them, and the dread of those 8 months was the first sign of the difficulties that the marriage would produce. The wedding took place on the 24th of April, 1854, in the Augustinerkirche in Vienna, the great church that had been the wedding chapel of the Habsburg family for centuries. Sisi had arrived in Vienna a few days earlier, having travelled by riverboat down the Danube from Bavaria, with the various stops along the way being the occasion for elaborate welcoming ceremonies in each town that the boat passed through. The ceremonies had exhausted her. The crowds had unnerved her. By the time she reached Vienna, she was already strained by the demands of her new role, and the wedding itself, with its hours of formal ritual and its enormous public attention, did not help her recover. The journey down the Danube is worth describing in some detail, because it was, in effect, the first sustained experience that Sisi had of what her new life would require of her. The Bavarian royal family had departed from Possenhofen, the lakeside castle where Sisi had grown up, on the 20th of April. The party had travelled by carriage to Munich, and then by train to Straubing, where they had boarded the imperial steamboat that had been sent up the Danube to collect them. The boat was decorated for the occasion, with flowers and bunting, and the imperial colours displayed prominently along its sides. The journey down the river took 3 days, with overnight stops at Linz and at the Abbey of Melk along the way. At every town and village along the river, crowds had gathered to see the imperial bride pass. The boat slowed at each major stop, with local dignitaries coming aboard to present formal greetings, with bouquets of flowers being thrown from the riverbanks, with cannons firing salutes from the various fortifications. Sisi was required to stand at the rail and acknowledge each greeting, smiling and waving at crowds that she had never seen before, accepting bouquets that piled up in her cabin until there was hardly room for her to move. The whole journey was a kind of 3-day public performance, with no real privacy and no real rest, and by the time the boat reached Vienna, she was visibly exhausted. The arrival in Vienna, on the 22nd of April, was more elaborate still. The boat docked at the wharf at Nussdorf, just upstream from the city, where Franz Joseph and his entire family were waiting to receive her. The formal greetings took over an hour. Then there was a procession, in elaborate state coaches, through the streets of Vienna to the Hofburg, with the streets lined 10 deep with crowds and with troops along the entire route. Sisi sat in an open carriage with Franz Joseph beside her, waving and smiling as the procession moved slowly through the city. She had never seen anything like it. She had never been the object of so much attention. By the time they reached the Hofburg, 2 hours later, she was reportedly weeping, though she tried to conceal it as best she could. The 2 days between her arrival and the wedding itself were filled with various preparations and ceremonies. There were formal presentations to the senior figures of the imperial court. There were rehearsals of the wedding ceremony itself, conducted with the precise attention to ritual that the Habsburg court demanded. There were fittings of the wedding dress which had been made in Vienna over the previous months, and which had to be adjusted to fit her exactly. There were endless meetings with the various senior court officials who would be responsible for her household after the wedding. Through all of this, she was operating on very little sleep and considerable nervous strain, and the photographs and portraits of her from those days show a young girl who is visibly tired and somewhat overwhelmed by what is being asked of her. She was 16 years old on the day of her wedding. Franz Joseph was 23. The ceremony was conducted by the Archbishop of Vienna, Cardinal Rauscher, who had been one of the strongest advocates of the match, and who after the wedding would become a trusted advisor to the imperial couple. The bride wore a white gown embroidered with silver, with a long train carried by various young noblewomen of the court. The groom wore the dress uniform of an Austrian field marshal. The couple exchanged vows in German, and the ceremony was conducted with all the elaborate ritual that the Habsburg family had developed over the centuries. After the wedding, the imperial party processed back to the Hofburg, where the formal wedding banquet was held, attended by the senior figures of the imperial family and the most important diplomatic representatives in Vienna. The wedding banquet itself was an exercise in the kind of formal ceremony that Sisi was completely unprepared for. The seating arrangements had been worked out weeks in advance with the precise order of precedence governing who sat where. The various courses of the meal were served according to elaborate rules about which dishes were presented to which guests in which order. The conversation was governed by the etiquette that prescribed who could speak to whom and on what subjects. Sisi, sitting at the head of the table beside her new husband, was supposed to lead the conversation among the senior guests in the way that an empress traditionally did at her own wedding banquet. She was, by all accounts, almost completely silent. She had nothing to say to these people, most of whom she had never met before that day. She did not know the proper forms of address. She did not know what subjects were appropriate. She sat through the long banquet, smiling at intervals, picking at her food, waiting for the whole thing to be over. The first night of the marriage took place in the Hofburg, in the imperial apartments that had been prepared for the new empress. The next morning, the formal ceremony of presentation took place, in which the new empress was formally introduced to the senior court officials and the leading figures of the Viennese aristocracy. By the third day, Sisi was already exhausted. The relentless schedule of formal events, the demands of the etiquette, the constant scrutiny of the court, all of this was overwhelming her in ways that her relatively informal Bavarian upbringing had not prepared her for. What happened next, in the first months of her marriage, was a slow collision between Sisi and the Habsburg court. The court, governed by its rigid etiquette and presided over by the formidable Archduchess Sophie, was not designed to accommodate the kind of free-spirited Bavarian girl that Sisi was. The court demanded conformity, predictability, the patient performance of ceremony day after day. Sisi was incapable of this kind of conformity, both temperamentally and by training. She did not know how to do what was being asked of her, and what she did know how to do, she did not want to do anyway. The daily routines of the imperial court in 1854 are worth describing in some detail, because they give a sense of what Sisi was struggling with. Each morning the Empress was woken at a precise hour by her senior lady-in-waiting, who entered the bedroom with a small entourage of attendants. The morning toilet was conducted in their presence, with the Empress's hair, her makeup, and her clothing all being managed by various specialized attendants in the order that the protocol required. The morning audience followed, with the senior officers of the household coming to receive their daily instructions, then the formal breakfast with various senior figures of the family, then the morning's official engagements, which might include receiving foreign diplomats, attending religious services, visiting charitable institutions, or any of the dozens of other public duties that the Empress's position required. The midday meal was served at 1 o'clock in the main dining room of the imperial apartments, with the family and the senior household officers in attendance. The afternoon was filled with further official engagements. The evening meal was served at 6. The evenings were generally spent in the imperial drawing rooms, with formal entertainments, conversations with senior visitors, and various other duties that the protocol prescribed. The whole day, from morning to evening, was governed by the etiquette and observed by an audience. There was almost no time, in the formal schedule, for private activities. There was almost no opportunity to be alone, to make personal decisions, to deviate in any way from the prescribed program. The court was a kind of continuous public performance, with every action being observed and assessed and reported on by the various witnesses who surrounded the Empress at every moment of her day. For Sisi, this regime was a form of suffocation. She had grown up in a household where the children were given considerable latitude, where the daily schedule was loose, where private time was abundant. She had ridden in the woods alone. She had spent hours reading in her own room. She had developed her own routines and her own preferences in the way that ordinary children of her class developed them. None of this was possible at the imperial court. The very notion of doing something privately, of having a moment to oneself in the day, was foreign to the system she now lived in. Her ladies-in-waiting accompanied her everywhere. The senior court officials watched her every action. The various visitors and dignitaries who passed through the imperial circle observed her constantly. She was in effect a public figure 24 hours a day, with no respite from the observation that her position required. The conflict centered increasingly on her relationship with Archduchess Sophie. The Archduchess, who had been the dominant female figure at the court for years, did not adjust easily to having a new empress in the house. She continued to behave as if she were the senior woman in the imperial family, with the new empress as her junior. She gave Sisi instructions on how to dress, how to behave, how to manage her household, how to organize her time. She criticized Sisi's manners, her conversation, her choice of friends. She intervened in Sisi's relationship with Franz Joseph, communicating directly with her son about Sisi's various failings and asking him to correct her behavior. The whole pattern, which would continue for years, was deeply distressing to Sisi, who had no experience of this kind of relentless senior interference and who did not know how to manage it. The Archduchess's interference reached its most painful form when the children began to arrive. Sisi's first child, a daughter named Sophie after her grandmother, was born in March of 1855, less than a year after the wedding. Almost immediately, the baby was taken from Sisi and placed in nurseries that were under the direct control of the Archduchess. Sisi was permitted to visit her daughter only at certain times, with the daily care of the child being managed by nurses and governesses appointed by the Archduchess. The arrangement was based on the principle that the heir of the Habsburg dynasty was too important to be left to the inexperienced care of a 16-year-old empress, and that the established imperial nursery system, with its trained personnel and its centuries of experience, was the proper environment for an imperial child. Sisi, who had expected to raise her own children in the relatively informal way that her own mother had raised her, was devastated by the arrangement and tried repeatedly to change it. She was unsuccessful. The Archduchess held firm, and Franz Joseph, caught between his mother and his wife, generally sided with his mother in these matters during the first years of his marriage. The pattern of nursery management was, in retrospect, one of the most damaging elements of the early marriage. The imperial nurseries were located in a separate wing of the Hofburg, with their own staff of nurses, governesses, and various other attendants who answered ultimately to the Archduchess rather than to the Empress. Sisi had to send word ahead when she wanted to visit her own daughter, and her visits were conducted under the watchful eye of the senior nursery staff, who would intervene if Sisi did anything they considered inappropriate, such as picking up the baby when the schedule called for her to be sleeping, or asking too many questions about the baby's daily routine. The whole arrangement treated Sisi, in effect, as a visitor to her own children rather than as their mother, and the daily emotional connection that ordinary mothers form with their infants was, for Sisi, simply not allowed to develop. The reasoning behind this arrangement, as the Archduchess explained it to anyone who asked, was that the proper care of imperial children required expertise and consistency that an inexperienced young mother could not provide. The Habsburg children were the future of the dynasty. Their physical health, their early education, their social training, all of these were too important to be left to the unsystematic management that ordinary aristocratic mothers practiced. The imperial nurseries had developed, over centuries, a precise system for the management of imperial childhood, with each stage of the child's development being managed according to established protocols. To allow a young empress to interfere with this system would be, in the Archduchess's view, an abdication of the dynasty's responsibility to its own future. The reasoning had a certain logic within the assumptions of the imperial system. It was also, of course, a justification for the Archduchess's continuing exercise of power within the imperial household, and for the marginalization of the new empress whom she had not chosen. The combination of dynastic logic and personal power-seeking is difficult to disentangle in the surviving record, but the effect on Sisi was the same regardless of the proportions of the motivation. She was prevented from being a mother to her own children in the most basic sense, and she resented this with an intensity that grew through the early years of her marriage and that never fully went away. The second child, another daughter named Gisela, was born in July of 1856. She was treated in the same way as her sister, taken from Sisi and placed in the imperial nurseries under the Archduchess's control. Sisi, by this point, was beginning to develop the patterns of withdrawal and resistance that would mark the rest of her life. She spent more time alone. She wrote letters to her family in Bavaria, expressing her unhappiness with the situation in Vienna. She began to develop the various physical and psychological symptoms that would, over the following years, become the persistent features of her health. The first major crisis came in 1857. In May of that year, the imperial family undertook a tour of the Hungarian provinces, with Sisi accompanying Franz Joseph on what was, in effect, her first major political role. She took both daughters with her, having insisted, against her mother-in-law's objections, that the children be allowed to travel. The insistence was, in part, a political gesture, since presenting the imperial children to the Hungarian people was a way of cementing the connection between the dynasty and the kingdom. It was also, more privately, an act of maternal assertion, with Sisi having decided that she would, at least on this trip, exercise the kind of direct contact with her children that her position normally denied her. While they were in Budapest, both daughters fell ill. Gisela recovered. Sophie did not. She died in Buda on the 29th of May, 1857, aged just over 2 years. The death of Sophie was a turning point in Sisi's life. The little girl had been showing the early signs of the strong personality that her mother also possessed, and Sisi had developed, in the brief periods of contact she had been allowed with her, a particular bond with this first child. The death came suddenly, after a brief illness, with Sisi sitting at the bedside through the final hours. She blamed herself for having insisted on bringing the children on the tour, even though the medical evidence suggests that the illness was the kind of childhood disease that would have been just as likely to occur in Vienna. She also, more privately, blamed her mother-in-law for the situation that had led to the death, for the long campaign of interference that had distanced her from her children, and made her insistence on bringing them to Hungary an act of defiance rather than a normal exercise of maternal judgment. The death of the child confirmed for Sisi that the imperial life was incompatible with the kind of family she wanted, and that some fundamental change in her circumstances would have to be possible if she were to continue to live in this way. The grief that followed the death was by all accounts severe. Sisi did not eat for days. She did not speak to anyone except in the briefest exchanges. She wept often and for long periods, in the way that bereaved mothers have wept in every culture and every era of human history. The grief was made worse by the fact that she had not been allowed to know her daughter in the daily way that ordinary mothers know their children, so that the bond she was mourning was a bond of maternal feeling rather than the more concrete bond of shared daily life that a more involved mother would have had. She was mourning, in some sense, what might have been the daughter she had never been allowed to fully know, as much as the daughter she had actually had. Franz Joseph grieved too in his way, but his grief was different. He had also not known the child well, but he had not been kept from her in the same active way that Sisi had been. He resumed his work, after a brief period of formal mourning, with the same patient determination that defined the rest of his life. He could not understand fully why Sisi was taking the death so much harder than he was. The misunderstanding that this produced between them, the sense on Sisi's part that he did not really understand her grief, was one of the early signs that the differences between them ran deeper than the simple romance of their meeting at Bad Ischl had suggested. The third child arrived in August of 1858. It was a boy, the long-awaited heir, named Rudolf in honor of the founder of the Habsburg dynasty. The birth of a male heir was an enormous political event for the empire, and Sisi was briefly the most celebrated figure in the imperial system. The celebration did not change her fundamental situation. Rudolf, like his sisters before him, was taken from her and placed in the imperial nurseries. She was permitted to see him at certain times. She was not allowed to manage his upbringing. The whole pattern of her relationship with her children, established with her first daughter, continued unchanged with her son. By the end of the 1850s, Sisi was approaching the breaking point. She had been at the imperial court for 5 years. She had borne 3 children, lost one of them, and been kept at a distance from the other 2. She had been continuously criticized and managed by her mother-in-law. She had developed a series of nervous symptoms, including persistent coughs, digestive problems, and what would now be called depression and anxiety. She had begun to retreat from public life, missing court events, declining to participate in formal functions, spending more and more time in her private apartments with a small circle of close attendants whom she could trust. The first major break came in 1860. Sisi, by that point, was suffering from what her doctors described as a severe nervous illness. She was advised that she needed to leave Vienna and to spend extended time in a different climate, both for the sake of her physical health and her mental state. After considerable discussion, the imperial court agreed to allow her to travel to the Portuguese island of Madeira in the Atlantic, where the climate was thought to be beneficial for the kind of nervous and pulmonary conditions that she was suffering from. She left Vienna in November of 1860, taking with her a small entourage of attendants. She would be away for 6 months. The departure was unprecedented. No Empress of Austria had ever before left the country for an extended private trip without her husband. The imperial public, which had limited access to the actual details of the Empress's condition, was given to understand that she was suffering from a serious illness and was travelling for medical reasons. Within the court, the situation was understood differently. The Empress was not so much suffering from a specific illness as from a comprehensive collapse of her ability to function in her role, and the trip to Madeira was as much an escape as a medical treatment. The journey to Madeira itself was complicated. There was no direct way to reach the island from Vienna in 1860. Sisi travelled by train across Europe to the Belgian coast, then by sea to England, where Queen Victoria had agreed to lend the imperial party a yacht for the onward voyage. The crossing from England to Madeira took about a week, with the yacht stopping at various ports along the way. Sisi spent much of the voyage on deck, watching the sea, breathing the Atlantic air, beginning the slow recovery from the nervous collapse that had driven her from Vienna. By the time the yacht reached the harbour of Funchal, the capital of Madeira, she was already feeling better than she had in years. The villa that had been arranged for her stay was a substantial property on the outskirts of Funchal, with views across the harbour and gardens that ran down to the water. The villa had been rented for the imperial party by the Portuguese authorities, and various members of the local European community provided the support that the Empress's stay required. The household was a small one, by imperial standards, with perhaps a dozen attendants in total, and the routines were correspondingly informal. Sisi rose late, walked in the gardens, read in the afternoons, dined quietly in the evenings. There were no formal events. There was no court. There was no Archduchess Sophie. The life she was living was, in the most essential sense, the life she had always wanted. The 6 months on Madeira were, by all accounts, restorative for Sisi. She was away from the court, away from the etiquette, away from her mother-in-law, away from the constant demands of her position. She walked in the gardens of the villa where she was staying. She read, she wrote in her diary. She slowly recovered her physical strength and a measure of her mental balance. She returned to Vienna in May of 1861, expecting, perhaps, that her absence had given the court time to adjust to her demands and that the situation would be different on her return. It was not. Within weeks of her return to Vienna, she had collapsed again. The same symptoms returned. the same patterns of withdrawal reasserted themselves. By the summer of 1861, she was again travelling, this time to the Greek island of Corfu, where she would spend much of the next year. The pattern was now established. She would return to Vienna for periods of weeks or months, attempt to fulfill the demands of her position, collapse under the strain, and travel away again. This pattern would continue for the rest of her life. She would, by the time of her death in 1898, have spent more of her marriage outside Vienna than within it. The patterns of her travel are worth describing in more detail, because they became, over the decades, one of the most distinctive features of her existence. She did not travel as ordinary aristocrats travelled, with a fixed itinerary and a series of social engagements at each stop. She travelled in a kind of restless flight, moving from place to place with very little advance planning, often deciding on her destination only a few days before she set out. She would arrive at a new location, take a villa or a hotel suite for some weeks or months, establish her routines, and then, when some unaccountable restlessness took her, move on to the next destination. The household staff who travelled with her had to be prepared for these sudden changes, with the various trunks and equipment ready to be packed and moved on short notice. Her preferred destinations changed over the years. In the 1860s, she favoured Madeira and Corfu with their warm climates and their seaside locations. In the 1870s, she added the British Isles to her circuit, particularly the hunting countries of Ireland and the western counties of England, where she would spend whole winters following the local fox hunts. In the 1880s, she returned to her Mediterranean preferences, with extended stays at Cap Martin on the French Riviera and the building of the Achillean on Corfu. In the 1890s, after the death of her son, she became even more restless, with shorter stays at each destination and a kind of wandering quality to her movements that her household found difficult to manage. But the travels did not stop until her death. What was she looking for in all of this travel? The question is interesting. She was not, in any obvious sense, looking for entertainment, since the destinations she chose were generally quiet and she avoided the major social centres of Europe. She was not looking for medical treatment, although the cover of medical necessity was the formal justification for many of her trips. She was not looking for political contact, although she did sometimes engage with the local political figures of the places she visited. What she seems to have been looking for, as best the surviving record allows us to reconstruct, was simply absence. Absence from Vienna, absence from the court, absence from the various demands and constraints that her position imposed on her in the imperial capital. The travels were, in this respect, a sustained negative project, a continuous flight from a life that she found intolerable, with the destinations being significant only insofar as they were not Vienna. Her physical regimens during these years became increasingly elaborate and increasingly extreme. She had always been preoccupied with her appearance, in the way that beautiful women in her position often were, but in the 1860s and 1870s the preoccupation became something more, an organizing framework for her daily life that took up enormous amounts of her time and energy. The beauty regimens are worth describing in some detail, because they are one of the more striking features of her life and one of the things she is most remembered for. Her hair, the famous long brown hair that fell to her ankles when loose, was the object of a daily ceremony that took 2 or 3 hours each morning. The hair was washed with a mixture of egg yolks and cognac, applied with care to maintain its colour and texture. It was combed out by her hairdresser, a Hungarian woman named Fanny Fayfalik, who served as her personal attendant for over 30 years. It was braided into the elaborate styles that the Empress favoured, with various coronets and arrangements that varied by the day of the week and the formality of the occasion. The whole ceremony of the hair was conducted in the presence of just 1 or 2 attendants, in the privacy of the Empress's dressing room, with very little conversation and a kind of ritual seriousness that her household had come to take for granted. Fanny Fayfalik herself is worth a brief description. because she was one of the most important figures in Sisi's daily life. She had been recruited from a Viennese theatrical wig maker, where she had been admired for her exceptional skill with hair. Sisi had brought her into the imperial household in the early 1860s and had made her not only the personal hairdresser, but also a kind of confidant and travelling companion. Fanny accompanied Sisi on most of her journeys, was responsible for the daily hair care routine wherever they happened to be, and developed, over the decades of her service, a deep familiarity with the Empress's moods and preferences that made her almost indispensable. She was paid a substantial salary by the standards of household staff, and she remained in Sisi's service until the end. The intensity of the relationship between Empress and hairdresser was in some ways deeper than the relationship between Empress and most other figures in the imperial circle. Fanny saw Sisi every day, in the most intimate setting of the dressing room, and the conversations they had during those long mornings of hair combing were, by various accounts, more candid than the conversations Sisi had with anyone else in her household. There was a particular ritual associated with the hair that the household attendants observed. Each morning after the comb-out and the washing and the styling, Fanny would present to the Empress a small silver tray on which any hair that had come loose during the work was carefully arranged. Sisi would inspect the tray, count the strands, and react to the count with an emotional intensity that the rest of the household found difficult to understand. A small number of strands meant a good morning. A larger number meant something approaching a disaster. The hair was, in a sense, the central metric of her physical well-being, and the daily inspection of the tray was a small ceremony that revealed how much of her psychological energy was invested in the maintenance of her appearance. Her diet, during these years, became increasingly restricted. She ate, for long periods, almost nothing but raw beef juice, milk, and a few selected vegetables. The beef juice was prepared from fresh beef that was pressed in a special apparatus to extract the liquid, with the resulting juice being drunk while still warm from the pressing. She believed, and the medical advice of her time supported the belief, that the juice contained the essential nutrients of the meat in a more easily absorbed form, and that drinking it provided sustenance without the digestive demands of eating actual meat. The medical theory was largely incorrect by modern nutritional understanding, but it had the effect that Sisi wanted, which was to keep her caloric intake very low, while allowing her to feel that she was being properly nourished. She measured her waist daily, with the obsessive attention of someone for whom the measurement was a critical metric. She wore tight-laced corsets that maintained her waist at an extraordinarily small circumference, around 47 centimeters at her smallest, which is to say less than 19 inches. The corsets were so tight that she sometimes had to be helped into them, with her ladies-in-waiting working for half an hour to lace them properly. The combined effect of the restricted diet and the extreme corseting was that she maintained well into her 50s the kind of slim figure that most women lose in their 20s. The cost of this maintenance, in terms of her physical comfort and her general health, was considerable. By her later years, she was suffering from various physical problems that were directly related to the long-term effects of the regimens, including chronic digestive issues and various postural problems from the corseting. She also exercised with an intensity that was unusual for women of her time and position. She had a gymnasium installed in her apartments at the Hofburg with rings, ladders, and various other gymnastic apparatus that she used daily. The gymnasium was set up in what had originally been one of her dressing rooms, with the apparatus being installed by Viennese workmen to her precise specifications. She used it for an hour or more each day, performing the exercises that her trainer had developed for her, with the kind of disciplined attention that elite athletes bring to their training. The household staff who occasionally caught glimpses of her at her exercises were, by various accounts, somewhat shocked at the intensity of the work. Since the physical exertion of an empress in a state of partial undress was not something that the imperial protocol had ever anticipated, she walked for hours at a time with such a fast pace that her ladies-in-waiting could not keep up with her. and her walks became famous in the various places where she stayed because of the difficulty her companions had in matching her stride. The walks were not strolls. They were, by all accounts, long sustained marches at a pace that approached 6 or 7 kilometers per hour, conducted in any weather, often for 3 or 4 hours at a time. The various ladies-in-waiting who were assigned to accompany her dreaded the walks, since they would generally end the walk exhausted, and with various physical complaints from the unaccustomed exertion. Sisi, who had grown up walking and riding in the Bavarian mountains, took a kind of pride in her ability to outwalk anyone the court could send with her. The walks were a private accomplishment that the rest of the imperial family could not match, and she valued them accordingly. She rode with extraordinary skill, becoming widely recognized as one of the finest horsewomen in Europe, regularly outriding the men in the various hunts she participated in. She had taken up riding seriously in her late teens, after the children had been born, and had developed her skills over the following decades into something that was genuinely exceptional. She rode with the major fox hunts of England and Ireland in the 1870s and 1880s, and was widely admired by the experienced riders of those hunts for her courage and her precise technique over difficult country. She had in her favourite hunting horses animals of extraordinary quality, kept in her own stables and managed by trainers she had recruited from the best riding establishments of Europe. The horses were a substantial expense, but Franz Joseph never complained about the cost, since he understood that the riding was one of the few things that gave her real pleasure in her difficult life. She learned to fence. She learned new sports as they came into fashion. The whole pattern of her physical life was one of constant activity, with her body being managed, trained and pushed in ways that the women of her time and class generally did not push themselves. What was she doing in all of this? Various biographers have attempted various interpretations. The simplest reading is that she was vain, a beautiful woman who was determined to remain beautiful, and that her regimens were the price she paid for the appearance she wanted to maintain. The more psychological reading is that she was using the regimens as a way of controlling something in her life, that her body was the one thing she could fully control in a position where so much else was determined for her, and that the obsessive attention to her physical state was a way of asserting agency in a circumstance where agency was otherwise difficult to achieve. The most sympathetic reading is that she was suffering from what would now be described as a serious eating-related condition, with the relentless thinness and the compulsive exercise being signs of a psychological condition that she did not understand, and that the medical practice of her time was not equipped to address. All three readings have something to recommend them, and the truth was probably some particular combination of all three panta. What is undeniable is that the regimens occupied an enormous portion of her time. By the 1870s, she was spending the majority of her waking hours on her physical maintenance, with the hair and the corseting and the exercises and the diet management taking up most of each day. She had, in effect, made her appearance her primary occupation, with the political and ceremonial duties of an empress being secondary at best. There was also, in these years, the writing. She had begun to write poetry in her teenage years, in the pattern of romantic Bavarian girls of her class, but in her adulthood, the writing developed into something more sustained. She filled long manuscript volumes with her poems, working in the style of Heinrich Heine, the German romantic poet whom she revered. The poems are, by most critical assessment, not particularly distinguished as poetry, but they are interesting as a record of her inner life. They speak of wandering, of solitude, of the impossibility of finding a true home in any place or any relationship. They invoke various mythological figures, particularly Greek heroes and the classical sea spirits that she had become attached to during her travels in the Mediterranean. They express in muted form the dissatisfactions and the longings of her actual life, with the imperial frame removed and the personal feeling allowed to come through. She kept the poems private during her lifetime, sharing them only with a small circle of intimates, with the manuscript volumes being preserved in her household and only published in selected form after her death. The themes of the poetry are worth describing because they tell us more clearly than any biographical fact what she thought about her own life. The dominant theme is restlessness. She wrote repeatedly about the impossibility of staying anywhere, about the seabird who could not nest, about the wandering soul that could not find its home. She wrote about the burden of public attention, with various figures in her poetry being besieged by crowds and observers who would not let them be themselves. She wrote about the bondage of marriage, with various poems describing chains, cages, and confinements that would seem more political and dramatic to a casual reader than the imperial bondage they were actually describing. She wrote about death often, with a kind of fascinated detachment that suggests she had thought about her own death frequently, and without much fear of it. There were also, scattered through the poetry, occasional poems addressed to Franz Joseph. These poems are interesting because they are more affectionate than the rest of the corpus might lead one to expect. She wrote in several poems about her gratitude to him, about the patience he had shown her, about the freedom he had given her even when she had not deserved it. The poems suggest, more clearly than her letters or her recorded conversation, that she did have real feelings for him, that the affection she expressed in her formal communications with him was not entirely a matter of conventional courtesy. The feelings were complicated, qualified, mixed with various other less affectionate feelings, but they were there in the more candid medium of the poetry, in a way that the more guarded media of her life did not always reveal. She also wrote poems for various dead friends and family members through the years, in the way that 19th century writers commemorated their losses through verse. The poems for the deceased baby Sophie, written in the years following 1857, are some of the most affecting in the entire corpus, with a directness of grief that the rest of her poetry, with its more literary self-presentation, generally avoided. The poems for Rudolph, written after Mayerling, are similarly direct, with the conventional poetic frame stripped away and the raw maternal grief allowed to come through. The poetry in this respect was not just a literary exercise, it was, for Sisi, a form of emotional processing, a way of working through the various losses and difficulties of her life in a medium that the rest of her existence did not allow her. This was the woman that Franz Joseph was married to, and here we come to the question of what their marriage actually was. In the years when she was travelling and exercising and starving herself and writing poetry and avoiding the court that he could not avoid, he was, throughout these years, working. He was doing the vast administrative work of an emperor of a multi-ethnic empire, getting up at 5 in the morning to be at his desk by 6, working through the day with only brief breaks, often returning to his desk after dinner for several more hours of paperwork. He kept her rooms ready for her in all the various imperial residences. He waited for her letters when she was away. He wrote to her regularly with the same affectionate consistency that he had shown from the beginning of their marriage. He missed her when she was gone, in the simple way that a husband misses a wife who is not there. The image of him at his work, alone in the imperial apartments, is worth pausing on for a moment. The Hofburg, in any of the long stretches when Sisi was away, was a quiet place. The household staff continued their routines, but the social life of the palace was reduced to the minimum that the emperor's bachelor existence required. He ate alone, generally, at a small table in his office, or in a private dining room, with only 1 or 2 attendants serving him. He worked alone at his desk for the long hours that filled most of his day. He attended his audiences alone, with the various ministers and officials coming to him one at a time. He went to bed alone, on the simple iron camp bed in the room adjacent to his office. The whole pattern of his life in those years was solitary in a way that the public role of an emperor would not have led one to expect. He was, in the practical sense of the word, a single man for most of his marriage, with the Empress's frequent absences turning his daily life into something closer to a widower's existence than to a husband's. Did this trouble him? The surviving record suggests, perhaps surprisingly, that it did not trouble him as much as one might expect. He had, by his temperament and by his upbringing, been formed for solitary work rather than for sociable domestic life. The marriage to Sisi, even at its closest, had not been a deeply companionable arrangement, and the slow withdrawal of her physical presence over the years was in some sense a continuation of patterns that had been there from the beginning, rather than a sharp break from a previous closeness. He had his routines. He had, in his later years, his friendship with Shrat to provide the warm companionship that his marriage no longer offered. The arrangement was not what he had hoped for in 1854, but it was the arrangement that had developed, and he made his accommodation with it without bitterness, in the way that he made his accommodation with everything else in his life. Did she miss him? The letters she wrote suggest something more like polite affection than active longing. The poetry she wrote, in the manuscript volumes that she kept private but that survived her, suggests that she was often somewhere else in her thoughts entirely, with her imagination occupied by various themes and figures that had nothing to do with her husband. She did, sometimes, return to him. She did, sometimes, write him affectionate letters. She did, in her way, care for him, but the depth of the caring on her side seems to have been less than the depth of the caring on his side. The asymmetry that had been visible from the early letters of their engagement remained, throughout the marriage, a defining feature of their relationship. There was, however, a period in the late 1860s when something different happened, and the marriage briefly entered a phase that was closer to the romantic ideal that Franz Joseph had presumably hoped for from the beginning. This phase had to do with Hungary, with the Hungarian Compromise of 1867, and with the central role that Sisi played in bringing it about. The Hungarian situation in the 1860s was the most pressing political problem of the empire. Hungary, the second largest territorial component of the empire after Austria itself, had been a source of constant political difficulty since the Revolution of 1848. The Hungarians had risen in revolution against Habsburg rule in 1848, had been suppressed by the imperial army with Russian assistance in 1849, and had been governed since then under a regime of military occupation and political marginalization. The arrangement was unstable. The Hungarians remained restive. The economic and political costs of holding Hungary down were considerable. By the mid-1860s, with the Austrian defeat by Prussia in the War of 1866 weakening the empire's position generally, it had become clear that some kind of accommodation with the Hungarians was necessary. The accommodation that was eventually achieved, the Compromise of 1867, transformed the empire into the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, with the Hungarians receiving substantial autonomy in their own affairs, while remaining united with Austria under the Habsburg crown. The compromise was the work of various diplomats and politicians on both sides, but Sisi played a particular role in making it possible. She had taken, from her earliest visits to Hungary, an unusual interest in the country. She had learned Hungarian, becoming fluent in a language that few Habsburg royals had ever bothered to acquire. She had cultivated friendships with Hungarian aristocrats, particularly the leading figures of the moderate Hungarian political faction. She had developed a genuine sympathy for the Hungarian cause, in a way that made her stand out among the senior figures of the imperial court. By the mid-1860s, she had become, in effect, the leading advocate within the imperial family for some kind of compromise with the Hungarians. The Hungarian language alone is worth pausing on for a moment, because her decision to learn it was both unusual and politically significant. Hungarian is a difficult language for a German speaker to acquire, with no relationship to the Indo-European language family and a grammatical structure that has very little in common with German. Most members of the Habsburg family, when they had any contact with Hungarian, had learned only the most basic phrases necessary for ceremonial occasions. Sisi went much further. She studied the language seriously, with Hungarian tutors for years, and reached a level of fluency that allowed her to converse with Hungarian aristocrats in their own language and to read Hungarian literature in the original. The decision to put in this kind of sustained intellectual effort in a difficult subject was characteristic of her when something engaged her interest. The Hungarian language engaged her interest in a way that few subjects had, and her mastery of it became, over the years, one of her real intellectual accomplishments. Her closest Hungarian friend was Count Gyula Andrassy, a charismatic Hungarian aristocrat who had been one of the leaders of the 1848 revolution, had been sentenced to death in absentia after the suppression, had spent years in exile in Paris, and had been pardoned and allowed to return to Hungary in the late 1850s. By the mid-1860s, he was emerging as the leading figure of the moderate Hungarian political faction, advocating for compromise with the imperial government. He met Sisi for the first time in the early 1860s, and the two of them developed a close friendship that lasted for the rest of his life. Andrassy himself was an extraordinary figure. He was tall, dark, with the distinctive Hungarian features and the sweeping moustache that the Hungarian nobility favoured. He was a brilliant conversationalist, fluent in several languages, with a kind of romantic gallantry that distinguished him from the more bureaucratic figures of the Austrian government. He had been condemned to death by the imperial authorities for his role in the 1848 revolution, and his return from exile had been the result of a personal pardon by Franz Joseph. The fact that the man condemned to death by the emperor would later become one of the closest friends of the Empress was in itself a small parable of the complicated history of Habsburg-Hungarian relations. The exact nature of the friendship between Sisi and Andrassy has been the subject of considerable speculation. The two of them clearly liked each other enormously. They corresponded regularly. They met whenever Sisi was in Hungary, which was often. They worked together politically on the Hungarian question through the negotiations that produced the 1867 compromise. Whether their relationship was ever physical, in the sense that the popular imagination has often supposed, is a question that the surviving evidence does not clearly answer. The probability, based on the documentary record, and on the practical difficulties of an extramarital relationship between such public figures, is that the friendship was platonic but emotionally significant. Sisi clearly cared for Andrassy in a way that she did not care for many other people in her life. They had between them the kind of intellectual and emotional connection that her marriage to Franz Joseph generally lacked. What seems to have drawn them together was not primarily romantic attraction in the conventional sense. It was rather a matching of temperaments and intellectual interests that allowed each of them to be themselves in the other's company in a way that was unusual for them in their respective public roles. He could speak openly with her about Hungarian politics in a way he could not speak with the Austrian officials he otherwise dealt with. She could speak openly with him about her dissatisfactions with the imperial life in a way she could not speak with anyone else in the imperial circle. They provided each other, in this respect, with a kind of intellectual oxygen that the rest of their lives did not provide. The friendship was real, and it was important to both of them, but it was a friendship rather than a love affair, and the historical evidence supports this reading more strongly than the more sensational alternatives. The Compromise of 1867 was negotiated through the spring of that year and finalized in June. As part of the arrangement, Franz Joseph was crowned King of Hungary in a separate ceremony in Budapest, with Sisi being crowned as his queen. The coronation took place on the 8th of June 1867 in the Matthias Church in the Buda Castle district, with Andrassy himself, by then the Hungarian Prime Minister, placing the crown on Franz Joseph's head as part of the ceremony. The coronation was, for Sisi, the great public moment of her life. She had championed the compromise. She had cultivated the Hungarian leadership that had made it possible. She had brought Franz Joseph and Andrassy together. The arrangement that emerged was, in significant part, her achievement, and the coronation was the public recognition of it. The coronation itself was an elaborate piece of Hungarian historical ceremony, drawing on traditions that went back to the medieval kings of Hungary. The crown of Saint Stephen, the historical crown of the Hungarian kingdom, was placed on Franz Joseph's head. The royal robes of the medieval Hungarian kings were placed on his shoulders. Various regional standards of the Hungarian crowned lands were displayed in the church. The whole ceremony was conducted in a mixture of Latin and Hungarian, with very little German, in a deliberate assertion of the Hungarian historical tradition that the new arrangement was meant to honour. For Franz Joseph, who had presided over the suppression of the Hungarian Revolution 18 years earlier, the ceremony was a kind of reconciliation with a country he had previously treated as an occupied territory. For Sisi, who had championed the reconciliation, it was the public acknowledgement of her political achievement. After the coronation, the crowds that lined the streets of Budapest cheered Sisi specifically, calling her name, recognizing her as the figure who had made the compromise possible. The cheering went on for hours, with the crowds following the imperial carriage through the streets and refusing to disperse. Sisi was for once genuinely happy in a public role. She was being celebrated by people whose celebration she actually valued. She was being recognized for an achievement that was specifically hers. She was, briefly, the kind of public figure that her position had always supposed her to be, but had never previously allowed her to become. In the months that followed the coronation, Sisi was, briefly, happy. The Hungarians had given her a country residence at Godolo, near Budapest, where she could spend as much time as she wanted, riding and walking and entertaining her Hungarian friends. She was pregnant for the 4th time, with the child who would be born the following April. She was, for once, in a phase of her life that seemed to be moving in the direction she wanted. Godolo itself was a substantial Baroque palace, built in the 18th century by the Grasalkovich family, surrounded by extensive parkland and forests that stretched for miles around the property. The Hungarian state had purchased the palace in 1867 and had presented it to Sisi as a personal residence in recognition of her role in the compromise. The gift was a particularly Hungarian gesture, with the practical character of giving a country house combined with the political symbolism of acknowledging her as the Queen of Hungary specifically rather than as the Empress of Austria. Sisi understood the significance of the gift, and she made of Godolo the closest thing she ever had to a personal home outside her family residences in Bavaria. She used the property as a base for her riding. The countryside around Godolo was excellent hunting country, with the kind of open fields and managed woodland that the Hungarian aristocracy used for the various forms of equestrian sport that they favoured. Sisi rode out from Godolo for hours every day she was in residence, with the Hungarian aristocrats who had become her friends accompanying her on the longer expeditions. She built up, over the years, a particular stable of horses at Godolo, with the best Hungarian horses being purchased for her use and trained by the Hungarian grooms whom she had recruited. The riding at Godolo was, by her own private accounts, the closest thing to genuine happiness she experienced in her later life, with a combination of physical exertion and the Hungarian landscape and the company of friends who actually understood her, producing a quality of contentment that the rest of her existence rarely matched. She also entertained at Godolo in a way that she did not entertain anywhere else. The Hungarian aristocracy, whom she had befriended and championed, were welcomed at Godolo with the kind of informal warmth that the Viennese court did not allow. There were dinners, in the smaller dining rooms of the palace, with the Hungarian families who had become her circle. There were evening gatherings with Hungarian music and Hungarian conversation, and the Hungarian language being spoken at the high table for the first time in any Habsburg residence. There were various smaller events, designed for the particular company that the Empress wanted to gather. The whole social life of Godolo was conducted on Sisi's own terms, in the way that the rest of her social life was not, and the Hungarian aristocrats who became part of her circle understood themselves as participating in something that the more formal imperial life could not provide. Shy. The child was born on the 22nd of April, 1868, in Budapest. It was a girl named Marie Valerie. She was, by Sisi's specific demand, exempted from the regime that had governed the upbringing of the older three children. She was raised from infancy by Sisi herself, with Sisi making the decisions about her care, her education, and her daily life. She was, throughout her childhood, the centre of Sisi's domestic affection in a way that the older children, Gisela and Rudolf, had never been allowed to be. She was, in family conversation, simply called the only child, with the implication that she was the only one who had been Sisi's in the way that a child should belong to its mother. The decision to raise Marie Valerie herself was, in retrospect, one of Sisi's most important assertions of autonomy. She had insisted, before the child was born, that the imperial nursery system would not be allowed to take this child from her in the way that it had taken the others. She had negotiated this directly with Franz Joseph, who, perhaps recognizing how badly the previous arrangements had affected his wife, had supported her demand. She had also negotiated it, more painfully, with Archduchess Sophie, who continued to believe that the imperial nursery system was the proper environment for a Habsburg child. The Archduchess, by 1868, was less powerful than she had been a decade earlier, and her opposition to the new arrangement could be overridden in a way that had not been possible with the older children. Sophie would die in 1872, 4 years after Marie Valerie's birth, and the Archduchess's role in the imperial household would gradually fade after that. By the time of her death, Sisi had finally established her right to manage her own youngest child, and the relationship between mother and daughter that resulted was one of the few unambiguous successes of Sisi's emotional life. The years between 1867 and 1872, the years from the Hungarian Compromise to the death of Archduchess Sophie, were the closest Sisi came to a period of stable contentment in her marriage. The compromise had been her great political achievement. The Hungarians had become her chosen people, with her time at Godolo and her excursions through the Hungarian countryside being the parts of her year that she most looked forward to. Marie Valerie was a baby, and then a small child, and the ordinary daily work of mothering a young child, which Sisi had been denied with her older children, gave her a kind of grounded purpose that the rest of her life had lacked. She was, in those years, more present in Vienna, more available to her husband, more involved in the ordinary domestic life of the imperial family. The marriage during those years was probably as close to functional as it ever became. But the period did not last. By the mid-1870s, with Marie Valerie growing older and the immediate emotional satisfaction of new motherhood beginning to fade, Sisi was returning to her older patterns. The travels resumed, the beauty regimens intensified, the poetry writing became more sustained, the visits to Vienna became briefer and rarer. The marriage settled back into the asymmetric arrangement that had been its underlying pattern, with Franz Joseph at his desk in Vienna and Sisi somewhere else, and the two of them connected only by the daily letters and the periodic reunions. Marie Valerie was, in many ways, the consolation of Sisi's later life. The relationship between the two of them, mother and daughter, was warm and close in a way that the rest of Sisi's family relationships were not. Marie Valerie, as she grew up, became Sisi's confidant, her companion on travels, the person to whom she explained herself in the way that she did not explain herself to anyone else. The diaries that Marie Valerie kept through her teenage years and her early adulthood are one of the most important sources we have for understanding Sisi in her later life, with Marie Valerie recording, with the clear-eyed observation of someone who knew her mother well, the various moods and concerns and contradictions that the formal record of Sisi's life does not capture. The diaries themselves are worth a brief description, because they have given historians an unusually intimate view of an empress who otherwise left a relatively guarded record. Marie Valerie wrote in them daily from her early teens, in the particular detailed way that thoughtful adolescent girls sometimes write in their diaries. She recorded conversations with her mother. She recorded her observations of her father. She recorded her assessments of the various figures who passed through the imperial circle. She also recorded her own developing thoughts and feelings in the way that diary keepers of any era do. The diaries were intended to be private, and they were not published in their full form until many decades after her death. The selections that have been published, however, give us a picture of Sisi as a mother and as a private person that is more candid than anything else in the historical record. What Marie Valerie's diaries reveal more than anything else is the complexity of Sisi's relationship with her own marriage. Marie Valerie observed her parents at close range in the various imperial residences and on the various trips that the family undertook together. She saw with the keen eye of a daughter who loved both of her parents the asymmetry between them, the patience of her father, the restlessness of her mother, the ways in which the two of them accommodated each other across the long years of the marriage. Her observations are, on the whole, sympathetic to both of them. She did not, in the way that observant children sometimes do, take sides between her parents. She tried, instead, to understand each of them on their own terms, and her diaries give us, perhaps better than any other single source, the texture of the marriage as it was actually lived. The other children, Gisela and Rudolf, grew up under different circumstances, and their relationships with their mother were complicated. Gisela married, in 1873, at the age of 16, to Prince Leopold of Bavaria, and lived thereafter in Munich with relatively little contact with her mother. The two of them remained on cordial terms, but the closeness that might have existed between mother and daughter had been broken too early to be recovered. Gisela went on to have a long and stable marriage, with 4 children of her own, and she lived until 1932, dying in Munich at the age of 76. She had, by all accounts, a happier life than either of her sisters, perhaps in part because the early break with the imperial nursery system had given her more freedom to construct her own marriage and her own family without the continuing involvement of the imperial machinery. Rudolf was a more complex case. He was, by all accounts, an intelligent and sensitive boy with intellectual and political interests that distinguished him from most of the other Habsburgs of his generation. He had been raised in his early years under the strict regime that the Archduchess Sophie had imposed, with various tutors and military officers in charge of his education. The regime had not been good for him. He had developed through his teenage years a kind of nervous instability that worried those who were close to him. He had also developed, in his political views, a much more liberal outlook than his father's, with sympathies for parliamentary government, for the various national minorities of the empire, and for the kind of political reform that Franz Joseph generally resisted. The relationship between father and son by Rudolf's 20s was strained. The relationship between son and mother was warmer, but not particularly close, with Sisi being often absent and Rudolf having grown up without the kind of maternal presence that might have helped him manage his various difficulties. Through the 1870s and 1880s, the patterns of Sisi's life remained consistent. She travelled. She maintained her physical regimens. She wrote her poetry. She visited Hungary, where she was always more comfortable than in Vienna. She built, in the late 1880s and early 1890s, a palace on the island of Corfu called the Achillean, after the Greek hero Achilles, whom she had become obsessed with. The Achillean was an extraordinary building, designed in a Greek revival style, decorated with statues of Achilles and various other heroes, intended as a private retreat where Sisi could be away from the imperial court for as long as she wanted. She used it for some years in the early 1890s before eventually losing interest in it and selling it after a few years. The Achillean deserves a longer description because it captures something of the increasingly fantastical character that Sisi's inner life had taken on by her later years. The villa was set high on a hill above the eastern coast of Corfu, with views across the Ionian Sea toward the Greek mainland. It was designed by an Italian architect, Raffaele Carito, in a kind of neoclassical fantasy style that combined Greek temple elements with Italian Renaissance villa architecture. The interior was decorated with elaborate frescoes depicting scenes from the Iliad and from Greek mythology. The gardens were laid out with formal terraces, statues of Greek heroes, and fountains that played continuously through the day. The whole property was a kind of sustained imaginative project, an attempt to construct, in physical form, the romantic Greek world that had become Sisi's literary obsession in her later years. The central figure of the Achilleans' iconography was Achilles, the Greek hero of the Trojan War, whose image appeared throughout the villa and gardens in various sculptural forms. The most prominent of these was a large bronze statue of the dying Achilles, depicting the hero pulling the fatal arrow from his heel as he collapsed in death. The statue was placed in the gardens where it could be seen from the main reception rooms of the villa. Sisi had become fascinated by Achilles in her reading of Heine and other German romantic poets, who had presented the figure as a tragic hero whose strength and beauty could not save him from the fate that was prepared for him. She identified in some way with this conception of Achilles, with his combination of magnificent physical existence and ultimate mortality, with his isolation from the ordinary lives of those around him. The villa was, in this respect, a kind of personal mythology, with Sisi placing herself, by implication, in the same imaginative space as the Greek hero whose image dominated the property. She used the Achillean for several seasons in the early 1890s, spending months at a time on the island, walking in the gardens, reading her Heine and her Greek classics, swimming in the sea, riding along the coastal paths. The villa was, briefly, the focus of her wandering life, the place where she came when she had nowhere else she wanted to be. But the absorption did not last. By the mid-1890s, she had lost interest in the place, finding it perhaps too settled and too constructed to satisfy the restless need for movement that defined her later years. She sold the property eventually, after only a few years of use, in a piece of self-protective behavior that was characteristic of her late period. She would not allow herself to become attached to any single place. The moment a place became home, she had to leave it. Imagine her, for a moment, on a quiet afternoon at the Achillean in 1892. She has walked that morning, along the cliff paths above the sea, in her customary fast pace, with one of her Greek-speaking attendants struggling to keep up behind her. She has returned to the villa for her midday meal, a small light meal of clear broth, and a few slices of bread that she has eaten in her private dining room. She has gone out into the gardens in the early afternoon and has settled herself on a stone bench near the bronze statue of the dying Achilles. She has a book with her. The book is one of her volumes of Heine, which she has been rereading for the 100th time. The afternoon is warm, the sea is visible, below the gardens in the great blue expanse that stretches away toward the Greek mainland. The cicadas are loud in the cypress trees. There is no one near her except the one attendant who is sitting at a respectful distance on a different bench. She is, for the moment, almost alone, in the way that she rarely allowed herself to be entirely alone. She reads for a while. She looks at the sea. She thinks, in the way that her diary entries from this period suggest she was thinking, about the various themes that her later years had brought her to: her dead son, her absent husband, her own mortality, the irrelevance in the end of all the imperial pomp that had defined her existence. She is 55 years old. She has, although she does not know it, only 6 more years to live. She is, on this particular afternoon, as close to peace as her life ever brought her. The Greek light, the sound of the cicadas, the distant blue of the sea, the book in her lap, the cool stone of the bench beneath her, the slow, patient breathing of an afternoon that has nothing in particular it requires of her. This is what she had been seeking in all the years of her wandering. Not happiness, exactly, not contentment. Just this kind of suspended quietness, where nothing was required and nothing was expected, and she could simply be alive briefly in a particular place with the world's demands held at bay. These were the moments in her later life that she lived for. She did not get many of them. Most of her days were filled with the various activities that her restlessness drove her into. The walks, the riding, the exercises, the hair management, the poetry writing, the constant motion that her temperament required. But there were, occasionally, these quieter moments, when the motion stopped and the light came in through the cypress trees, and she was, for a few minutes or a few hours, simply present in her own life. The Achillean was where these moments most often happened. The villa, despite all its architectural excess, did provide her with the conditions in which she could, occasionally, just sit and look at the sea and let the day take care of itself. This was perhaps the closest thing to home that she ever found. Franz Joseph, through all of this, continued his work. He woke at 5. He worked. He attended the various ceremonies that his position required. He went to bed early. He wrote his letters to his absent wife. He developed in the 1880s a particular friendship that became one of the consolations of his later life with an actress named Katharina Schratt. Franz Joseph's daily routine by the 1880s had settled into the pattern that would define the rest of his life. He rose at 4:30 in the morning, in summer and in winter alike, with the assistance of a single valet who brought him hot water for washing and a simple breakfast of bread and coffee. He was at his desk by 5. He worked through the morning on the papers that the imperial bureaucracy generated in vast quantities, signing documents, reading reports, writing brief instructions to his ministers and his officials. He took a brief midday meal, generally alone or with 1 or 2 close attendants, of simple food prepared in the imperial kitchens. He returned to his work in the afternoon, with audiences for various officials and visitors filling the time between his desk work. He took his dinner in the early evening, again generally alone or in small company, before returning to his desk for the evening's work. He went to bed at 9 or 10 on the simple iron camp bed that he had used since his army days and that he refused to replace with anything more comfortable. The simplicity of his personal life was a deliberate choice, and it was one of the ways in which he distinguished himself from many of his royal contemporaries. He wore, in his ordinary working life, a plain military uniform with the rank insignia of an Austrian field marshal, but with very few of the elaborate decorations that other monarchs of the period favoured. He ate the same simple food day after day. He slept in the same simple bed. He kept the same simple routines. The whole pattern of his daily life was one of austere bureaucratic devotion to his work, with very little personal indulgence, very little luxury, very little of the pomp that the Habsburg position theoretically allowed him. This austerity was, in its way, a kind of love for his wife. She was extravagant in her physical preferences, with her elaborate beauty regimens and her expensive travels and her custom-built Greek villa. He did not begrudge her any of this. He paid for all of it without complaint, and he supported her right to live in the way that she chose to live. But for himself, he wanted simplicity. He wanted the plain bed, the plain uniform, the plain food. He wanted the daily working life of a senior bureaucrat rather than the luxurious life of an emperor. The contrast between the two of them, his austerity and her extravagance, was one of the many ways in which they were different from each other, and one of the ways in which they nevertheless coexisted in a marriage that, despite all its difficulties, continued to function until the end. Katharina Schratt entered his life in 1885. The relationship between Franz Joseph and Katharina Schratt is one of the more interesting features of his life, and a subject that has been much debated. Schratt was a successful actress at the Imperial Court Theatre in Vienna, a woman of about 30 when their friendship began. She was attractive, intelligent, warm, and utterly different from the formal aristocratic women that Franz Joseph normally encountered. The friendship was, by all surviving evidence, encouraged by Sisi, who actively introduced Schrat to her husband and who supported the development of the relationship that followed. Sisi seems to have understood that Franz Joseph needed a female companion in her absence, that he was a man who needed warmth and conversation and the ordinary attentions of female company, and that since she herself was not going to provide these things, someone else needed to. The introduction itself is worth describing because it captures something of the unusual triangular arrangement that the three of them eventually constructed. Sisi had seen Schrat perform on stage in Vienna and had been impressed by her warmth and her natural, unaffected manner. She had arranged through the imperial household for Schrat to be invited to a small private gathering at the Hofburg, where she presented the actress to her husband as someone whose company she thought he might enjoy. Franz Joseph, who had spent his life in the formal company of aristocratic women, was charmed by Schrat's directness and her ordinary conversation. Sisi observed the meeting with satisfaction, recognized that the introduction had been successful, and quietly withdrew herself from the developing friendship, while making clear to her husband that she did not object to its continuation. The exact nature of the relationship that developed between Franz Joseph and Schrat has never been definitively established. The most informed scholarly opinion, based on the surviving correspondence and the various accounts of those who knew them both, is that the relationship was warm, deep, and probably platonic. Franz Joseph visited Schrat regularly in her villa near Bad Ischl. They breakfasted together. They walked together. They wrote to each other constantly when apart. They were, in the practical sense of the word, intimate friends, with the kind of long-standing daily companionship that some marriages aspire to. Whether they were ever physical lovers is a question that the evidence does not clearly answer. The probability is that they were not, but the friendship was so close and so warm that the distinction may be less important than it seems. What is clear is that Schrat provided Franz Joseph with something that his marriage no longer provided, and that Sisi recognized this and accepted it, and that the arrangement worked for all three of them in a way that very few such arrangements ever do. The arrangement also reveals something about Sisi's love for her husband, or the absence of it. A wife who was deeply in love with her husband would generally not have arranged for another woman to provide him with the daily companionship that the marriage was no longer providing. The fact that Sisi did so and did so without bitterness or resentment suggests something about the nature of her feelings for him. She cared for him. She wished for his happiness. She did not, however, want to be the one providing that happiness on a daily basis. The Schrat relationship was, in this respect, a piece of practical management that Sisi undertook on Franz Joseph's behalf, recognizing what he needed and arranging for him to have it. It was the act of someone who cared for him as one might care for a dear friend, but not the act of someone who loved him as a wife loves a husband. The crisis that overshadowed everything else in the last decade of Sisi's life arrived on the 30th of January, 1889. The Crown Prince Rudolf was found dead at the Imperial Hunting Lodge of Meierling, near Vienna, along with his 17-year-old mistress, Mary Wetzera. The deaths were, by the eventual official account, a murder-suicide, with Rudolf having shot Mary and then himself. The exact circumstances have been debated for over a century, with various theories proposed about whether it was a suicide pact, a murder-suicide as the official account had it, or something more complex. The balance of evidence supports the murder-suicide interpretation, but the full circumstances of the deaths have never been definitively established, and the imperial court took elaborate measures at the time to control the public narrative around what had happened. Rudolf himself, in the years before his death, had become an increasingly troubled figure. He had grown into a man of considerable intelligence, with a lively interest in politics, journalism, and the natural sciences. He had also, however, developed a series of personal difficulties that the imperial system was not equipped to address. His marriage, contracted in 1881 to Princess Stephanie of Belgium, had not been happy. Stephanie, by various accounts, was conventional, dutiful, and not well suited to the temperamental and intellectually restless husband she had been given. The two of them had a daughter, Elizabeth Marie, born in 1883, but the marriage had effectively broken down within a few years of the wedding. Rudolf, in his 30s, had developed various entanglements with other women in the pattern of unhappy aristocratic men of his generation. He had also developed political views that put him in increasing tension with his father. He was a liberal in the European sense of the word, with sympathies for parliamentary government, for the various national minorities of the empire, and for the kind of political reform that Franz Joseph generally resisted. He wrote anonymously for liberal newspapers in Vienna, in articles that criticized the policies of his father's government. He cultivated friendships with liberal politicians and journalists. He saw himself increasingly as an alternative to his father, with a different vision of what the empire should become. The fact that he was the heir and that the empire would eventually be his to govern gave these views a political weight that the imperial court found increasingly worrying. By the late 1880s, Rudolf was also showing signs of more serious psychological difficulty. He drank too much. He took various medications that were available in his time, including morphine, in quantities that were probably damaging to his health and his judgment. He spoke to those closest to him about death and about the impossibility of his situation. He had, by various accounts, broached the subject of a death pact with several women, including his Belgian wife, before finding, in the 17-year-old Mary Wetzera, someone who was willing to enter into the arrangement. Mary Wetzera was a young woman from the Viennese minor nobility, beautiful and infatuated with the crown prince in the way that some young women become infatuated with figures of romantic public standing. She had been pursuing his attention for some months. He had, eventually, returned the attention, and the two of them had become involved in a brief but intense relationship that ended at mailing. The full circumstances of how she came to be at the hunting lodge, and how the events of that night unfolded, were the subject of an elaborate cover-up at the time, and have remained the subject of historical investigation ever since. What is known is this. Rudolf and Mary Wetzera were both at the lodge on the night of the 29th of January 1889. They were found dead in the bedroom of the lodge on the morning of the 30th. They had both been shot. Mary had been killed first, several hours before Rudolf, by a single shot. Rudolf had killed himself with a gun some time later. The bodies were discovered by Rudolf's valet when he came to wake the prince in the morning. The valet immediately notified the senior officials at the lodge, who notified Vienna, where an elaborate process of damage control was set in motion. The imperial court's first instinct was to suppress the entire matter. The official announcement, in the first hours after the discovery, said only that the crown prince had died at mailing. No mention was made of Mary Wetzera. The cause of death was not specified. Within hours, however, the truth began to leak out, and the court was forced to issue a series of revised statements, each one a little more candid than the last. Eventually, after several days of confusion, the basic outline of what had happened was acknowledged, although the full details remained obscure for many decades afterward, and some aspects of the case remain contested even now. Mary Wetzera's body was removed from the lodge in secret on the night after the deaths, and buried hastily in a small cemetery near Meiling. The arrangements were so undignified that her family was, for years afterward, unable to obtain a proper burial for her. Rudolf's body was returned to Vienna, where he was given a state funeral with all the ceremony that the death of a crown prince required. The Vatican, after considerable diplomatic pressure, agreed to permit the religious burial on the official medical determination that Rudolf had been mentally ill at the time of his death, and was therefore not responsible for his own actions. For Sisi, the death of Rudolf was the deepest blow of her life. She had not been close to him in his early years, but she had grown closer to him in his adulthood, particularly as his marriage to Princess Stephanie of Belgium had proved unhappy, and as his various political and personal difficulties had multiplied. She had not understood the full depth of his troubles, but she had cared for him in her way, and his sudden death at 30 was a wound that she would carry for the rest of her own life. The news of Rudolf's death was brought to Sisi by an attendant at the Hofburg in the late morning of the 30th of January. Sisi had been at her morning exercises in her gymnasium when the message arrived. She received the news in the silent, controlled way that her training had taught her to receive bad news. She walked to her husband's office to see whether he had been told. He had not. She told him herself, in the simple, direct way that the situation required. He, who had not seen the news coming, and who had not been prepared for it, broke down in a way that the surviving accounts describe as harrowing for those who witnessed it. Sisi held him in the quiet professional way of a woman who has learned to manage her husband's emotional crises, and the two of them sat together in his office for some hours before either of them was able to speak about what came next. The funeral, when it was held a few days later, was an enormous public ceremony, with the body lying in state in the imperial chapel, and thousands of mourners passing through to pay their respects. Sisi attended in heavy black mourning, with her face heavily veiled. She stood beside her husband through the various ceremonies. She did not weep in public. She did not speak to the senior figures who came to offer condolences. She maintained, throughout the formal mourning period, the rigid composure that the imperial protocol required. In private, the grief was different. She wept for hours at a time in the privacy of her rooms. She wrote in her diary and in letters to her closest confidants about the despair she felt and about the impossibility of recovering from this particular loss. She blamed herself, in various ways, for not having been a better mother to Rudolf during his early years, for not having been more attentive to his difficulties as he grew up, for not having recognized the depth of his unhappiness in time to prevent what had happened. The blame was, in part, the natural blame of a bereaved parent who needs to make sense of an incomprehensible loss. It was also in part the more specific blame of a mother who had been kept at a distance from her son in his childhood, and who could now see, with the clarity that hindsight provides, what that distance had cost. She wore black, after Meierling, for the remaining 9.5 years of her life. She had always preferred dark colours in her clothes, but the formal mourning that she adopted after January 1889 was different in kind from her earlier preferences. She did not wear colour, did not appear at most public events, did not engage with the imperial court except on the most necessary occasions. She travelled even more than she had before, spending whole years away from Vienna, with brief returns for the most necessary occasions. She seemed in those years to be fading from the public life of the empire, becoming a kind of distant figure whose actual presence was rare even in the places where she was traditionally expected to be. Franz Joseph, who had also been deeply affected by Rudolf's death, returned to his work with the same patient determination that had carried him through every other difficulty of his life. He continued to rise at 5. He continued to work. He continued to write his daily letters to his wife and to Katharina Schratt. He continued to do the things that an emperor of Austria was expected to do, with the quiet stoicism that his temperament had always favoured. He grieved, in his way. He kept Rudolf's rooms in the imperial palaces preserved as the young man had left them. He maintained the formal mourning that the court protocol required for the death of a crown prince. But he did not, in the public sense, break down. He did not retreat. He continued to be the figure that the empire needed him to be. Sisi, by contrast, did break down, and her later years were marked by the slow processing of a grief that she could not seem to come through. She withdrew further from public life. She travelled even more than she had before. She became, in those years, a kind of ghost in the imperial system, present only at the most necessary public events and otherwise absent from the daily life of the empire. Her hair, the famous long brown hair that had been the central feature of her physical appearance, began to show grey, and she covered it with the heavy black veils that she now wore in her formal mourning. Her face, which had been remarkably preserved through her 50s by the various regimens, began to show the lines and the heaviness that grief and age were imposing on it. She refused, after the late 1880s, to be photographed any longer, and the public images of her from her last decade are very few. She had become, in some sense, a private figure, with her later existence being known to historians mainly through the writings of those who saw her in her travels and the occasional brief diplomatic notes that her movements generated. Her relationship with Franz Joseph in those last years took on a new character. The asymmetry of their feelings remained, but the practical arrangement of their marriage shifted into something closer to a partnership of two grieving parents than the previous pattern of restless wife and patient husband. They corresponded more often. When she was in Vienna, she spent more time with him than she had in the previous decades. They visited Rudolf's tomb together. They consulted each other about the various practical matters of the succession, with the throne now needing to pass to Franz Joseph's nephew rather than to his son. The shared loss of their child gave them a common ground that the rest of their marriage had not provided, and the late marriage had a kind of closeness that the earlier marriage had only intermittently achieved. What she felt in those years about her husband is one of the more interesting questions that the historical record allows us to consider. She was, by all accounts, kinder to him in those years than she had been earlier. She wrote him longer letters. She visited him more frequently. She took, occasionally, his arm in public when they walked together, in a way that she had rarely done in the earlier years. The visible affection was greater than it had been, whether this was because her feelings had changed or because the shared grief had simply created a new emotional context in which the existing feelings could be expressed more openly, is impossible to say definitively. But the surviving evidence of those last years suggests that she had, in some way, come to value him more than she had earlier valued him, and that the years remaining to them were, in a quiet and unspectacular way, closer than the years that had come before. The last years of Sisi's life, from 1889 to 1898, were spent largely in motion. She travelled to Cap Martin on the French Riviera. She travelled to Madeira, returning to the place where she had first escaped from the court more than 30 years earlier. She travelled to England, where she rode with the local hunts in Gloucestershire. She travelled to Greece, where she had spent so much time in earlier years. She visited Hungary, where she felt most at home. She maintained her physical regimens. She wrote her poetry. She continued to live the life she had constructed for herself, the life of a wandering imperial figure who belonged to no particular place and who answered to no particular schedule. The British Isles deserve a particular mention because she had developed a deep affection for them in the 1870s and 1880s and continued to return to them through her later years. Her first visit had been to Ireland in 1879, where she had rented a hunting lodge in County Meath and had spent 2 months riding with the local hunts. The Irish hunting country, with its open fields and its formidable stone walls and its long tradition of skilled cross-country riding, had suited her perfectly. She had ridden with such daring and such skill that the experienced Irish riders, who were generally not impressed by foreign visitors, had recognized her as one of the finest cross-country riders they had ever seen. She had returned to Ireland in 1880 and had visited various English hunting countries through the 1880s, with extended stays in Gloucestershire, in Northamptonshire, and in the various other counties whose hunts had welcomed her. The hunts themselves were not, for Sisi, primarily about killing foxes. They were about the riding. The pursuit of the fox across country gave her a structured framework within which she could ride at speed, take her horses over difficult obstacles, and demonstrate the considerable skills that she had developed over years of practice. She rode with a particular intensity that the other riders sometimes found unsettling. She did not stop for tea breaks. She did not slow down at difficult fences. She rode, for the full length of each day's hunt, with the kind of single-minded concentration that suggested she was working through something more personal than the ordinary sporting pleasure of the activity. Her companions on these hunts, including the various noblemen and ladies who hosted her in the country houses where she stayed, sometimes commented in their letters on the strange intensity of her riding, and on the sense they had that the hunt was, for her, a kind of necessary daily ritual rather than an entertainment. That way, Cap Martin, on the French Riviera, became her favourite winter destination in the late 1880s and through the 1890s. The small resort village set between Monte Carlo and Menton on the Mediterranean coast offered her the warmth and the privacy and the quietness that she preferred in her later years. She stayed at the Grand Hotel du Cap Martin in a suite of rooms that had been adapted to her requirements, with her own household staff in attendance. She walked, every morning, along the coastal paths that wound through the cliffs and the olive groves above the sea. She read, in the afternoons, in the gardens of the hotel. She wrote in her diary and her poetry notebooks, in the careful hand that she had used since her youth. The pattern of life at Cap Martin was, for her, as close to contentment as she ever achieved in her later years, with the warm climate and the absence of formal demands, allowing her to settle into a slow, patient rhythm that the colder northern courts could not provide. She also returned, repeatedly through her later years, to the various locations of her earlier life. She visited the Achilleon on Corfu, even after she had sold it, going back to walk in the gardens and to look at the statues that had once been hers. She visited Bavaria, the country of her childhood, with extended stays at Possenhofen and at the various other family residences where she had grown up. She visited Hungary, particularly her beloved Godolo, where the Hungarians always welcomed her with the warmth that she had earned with her championing of the 1867 Compromise. The visits had a kind of valedictory quality, as if she were saying goodbye to the various places of her life, although there is no evidence that she consciously understood them this way at the time. She was simply moving, in her restless wandering pattern, from one familiar place to another, with the visits accumulating, in retrospect, into a kind of farewell tour of the geography of her existence. The end came in Geneva on the 10th of September 1898. She was 60 years old. She was travelling, as she so often did, with a small entourage, and she was staying at a hotel on the lake. She had walked, that morning, with her lady-in-waiting, from the hotel to the steamboat that was waiting to take her across the lake to her next destination. She walked along the lakeside path. A young man, standing at the side of the path, suddenly stepped forward and struck her in the chest with a small, sharpened file. She fell, then got up, then continued walking to the steamboat with the help of her lady-in-waiting. The blow had been so quick and the wound so small that she did not realize at first what had happened. The tightness of her corset had compressed the wound and prevented it from bleeding visibly. She boarded the steamboat. The boat pulled away from the shore. After a few minutes, she collapsed. The boat returned to the shore. She was carried back to her hotel. She died there a short time later. The day itself, the 10th of September, had begun ordinarily. Sisi had been staying at the Hotel Beau Rivage, on the lakeside in Geneva, under the assumed name of Countess of Hohenems that she sometimes used when travelling privately. She had arrived from Caux, in the Swiss mountains, the previous afternoon. She had spent the morning walking along the lakefront and visiting various small shops in the old town. She had been in good spirits, by the accounts of those who saw her that morning, and had been planning to take the steamboat across the lake to continue her journey. She was accompanied, on the walk to the boat, only by Countess Irma Stare, a Hungarian lady-in-waiting, who had been with her for several years, and who was one of the small group of attendants she travelled with in her later years. The walk from the hotel to the steamboat dock took about 10 minutes along the lakefront promenade. The two women walked together, with Sisi in front in her customary fast-walking pace, and Countess Stare slightly behind. They had walked perhaps half the distance when the young man stepped forward from where he had been waiting beside the path. The whole encounter, by the various accounts, took only a few seconds. Sisi did not see the man clearly. She did not understand at the time what had happened. She thought, in the moments after the blow, that she had been struck or pushed by someone, but she did not realize that she had been wounded. Her killer was a young Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini, who had been wandering through Switzerland looking for someone of high enough rank to make a notable assassination victim. He had originally been planning to kill the Duke of Orleans, who had been expected in Geneva but had not arrived. Sisi happened to be in the city. Lucchini decided that an empress would do as well as a duke. He had no particular grievance against her personally. She was, for him, simply a representative of the imperial system that he opposed, and her death was an act of political violence directed at the system rather than at the woman. He was arrested almost immediately. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment, since Switzerland did not have the death penalty. He died in his prison cell in 1910 by suicide 12 years after the assassination. The hours between the attack and Sisi's death are worth describing with some care, because the cover-up of the wound by her own corset is one of the more poignant details of the story. After the blow, Sisi got up from where she had fallen, told Countess Stare that she was fine, and continued to walk to the steamboat. She walked the remaining distance, perhaps 100 meters, without obvious difficulty. She boarded the boat. She allowed herself to be helped to a bench on the upper deck. The boat pulled away from the dock. It was only when the boat was a few minutes out into the lake that Sisi suddenly turned pale and began to slump forward, with Countess Stare realizing for the first time that something was seriously wrong. The Countess loosened the Empress's bodice and saw, on the white blouse beneath, a small spot of blood, no larger than a coin. The wound, made by the small, sharpened file rather than by a knife, was so narrow that very little external bleeding had taken place. Internally, however, the file had penetrated her chest and had pierced her heart. She was, by the time the bodice was loosened, already dying. The boat was turned around and brought back to the shore. Sisi was carried on a makeshift stretcher made from a sail back to the Hotel Beau Rivage. A doctor was called. Various efforts were made to revive her. None of them could succeed. The wound was simple and small, but it had been made in exactly the wrong place, and the medical practice of 1898 had no answer for what the file had done. She was pronounced dead at about 2:30 in the afternoon, perhaps 2 hours after the attack. When the news reached Franz Joseph in Vienna, in the early evening of the day of the killing, he is reported to have said only simply, "You do not know how much I loved this woman." The phrase has been repeated in every subsequent account of his reaction. It captures in its plain and unself-conscious way the depth of feeling that he had carried for her throughout the 44 years of their marriage. He had loved her, in the simple, direct sense that he had used the word, and he had continued to love her even as she had withdrawn from him, spent more and more of her life away from him, even as the marriage had become more an arrangement of mutual respect than a union of shared daily life. The fact of his love had not depended on her returning it in the same form. It had been there throughout the marriage, and it remained there at the end, in the quiet phrase that he gave to whoever was with him when the news arrived. He lived for another 18 years. He continued his work. He continued his routines. He continued his friendship with Katharina Schratt, though she was now older, and they saw each other less often. He kept Sisi's rooms preserved as she had left them, in the various imperial palaces, with her dressing table still arranged with the brushes and the bottles she had used, with her clothes still hanging in her wardrobes, with the various small personal objects of her life still in the places where she had put them. The rooms became a kind of memorial to her, kept in the state of her last visits, with the staff who had served her continuing to maintain the spaces as if she might return at any moment. Sisi's body was brought back to Vienna by special train, arriving on the 15th of September. The funeral, held 2 days later, was an enormous public ceremony, with foreign royalty and senior diplomats from across Europe in attendance. The body was carried in a black-draped hearse from the Hofburg to the Capuchin Church, the small Capuchin friars' church in the inner city that has served as the burial place of the Habsburg family for over 3 centuries. The vault beneath the church, the Capuchin crypt, contains the remains of more than 100 members of the Habsburg dynasty in elaborate sarcophagi arranged through a series of underground chambers. Sisi's sarcophagus was placed in one of the more recent chambers, in a relatively simple bronze tomb that she had not chosen for herself, but that had been selected by the imperial household. Beside her, eventually, would be placed the tomb of her son, Rudolf. Beside Rudolf, 18 years later, would be placed the tomb of Franz Joseph himself. The 3 of them, mother and son and husband, would lie together in the same chamber of the Capuchin crypt, where they remain to this day. The funeral itself was conducted with all the ceremony that the Habsburg tradition required. Franz Joseph attended throughout, walking behind the hearse in the procession from the Hofburg to the church, standing through the long Latin Requiem Mass, descending into the crypt for the final committal. He wept, openly, several times during the proceedings, in a way that he had rarely allowed himself to weep in public before. The various foreign royalty who attended noted in their private dispatches home that the emperor seemed visibly aged by the experience, with the weight of the loss showing on him in a way that the rest of his life had not previously revealed. He worked. He survived the various subsequent difficulties of his reign. He survived the assassination of his nephew and chosen heir, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo in June of 1914, and the catastrophic war that followed it. He continued to work into his 80s with the same patient devotion that had defined his life. He died in the Schönbrunn Palace on the 21st of November 1916, in the 3rd year of the war that would destroy his empire, 2 years before the final collapse of the Habsburg state that he had spent 68 years preserving. The 18 years between Sisi's death and his own are worth describing in their general shape, because they show what the life of the surviving partner looked like after the marriage had ended. He continued in those years to write his daily letters to Katharina Schratt, who had become, in effect, his closest confidant and companion. The letters from this period have survived in considerable numbers, and they give us a picture of the elderly emperor that is more candid than almost any other record of his inner life. He wrote about his work in the same careful detail that he had used in his earlier letters to Sisi. He wrote about the weather, about the small events of his daily routine, about the various visitors who passed through his life. He wrote about his health, which was generally good for a man of his age, but which was beginning to decline as the years passed. He wrote about his wife, occasionally, in the way that a widower writes about his late wife to a friend who knew her, with a mixture of grief and affection and the slight idealization that distance produces. The decline of the empire in his last years was not something that he could fully see, although the signs were there for those who looked carefully. The various national movements within the empire continued to grow. The political pressures from outside continued to increase. The economic difficulties of the empire's complex multi-state structure continued to mount. He responded to these various challenges with the same patient persistence that had defined his earlier reign, working through the various crises one by one, signing the various treaties and decrees that the situation required, attempting to hold together a structure that was increasingly beyond any single ruler's ability to preserve. He did his work. He did what he could. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand on the 28th of June, 1914, was the immediate cause of the war that would destroy the empire. Franz Ferdinand had become the heir to the throne in 1896, after the death of his father had moved him into the line of succession following Rudolf's death in 1889. He had been a difficult heir for Franz Joseph to deal with views and personality that did not entirely match the older man's, but he had been the heir, and his murder by a Bosnian Serb nationalist in Sarajevo was both a personal blow and a political catastrophe. Franz Joseph received the news at his residence in Bad Ischl, where he had been spending the summer. He read the telegram. He did not, by the various accounts of those present, react with much external emotion. He had by then lost so many of those closest to him that the loss of one more, even one in this position, did not produce the kind of breakdown that the news of Sisi's death had produced 16 years earlier. He had become, in the way that very old people sometimes become, almost beyond grief, with the cumulative weight of his various losses having reached a level that no individual additional loss could meaningfully add to. The war that followed the assassination was the catastrophe that would destroy his empire. Austria-Hungary's ultimatum to Serbia, the response from Russia, the chain of alliance commitments that drew in Germany, France and Britain, all of these unfolded in the weeks following the murder, with Franz Joseph signing the various declarations of war that the situation required. He had wanted, as he had told various of his ministers in those weeks, simply to act decisively against Serbia for what he saw as the murder of his nephew. He had not anticipated the full scope of what would follow. The general European war that emerged in August of 1914 was something he had not wanted and had not foreseen, but he was, by the time he understood what was happening, already committed to it, and he could only continue to work through the war with the same patient devotion that had defined the rest of his life. The war went badly for the empire from the beginning. The Austrian armies advancing into Serbia suffered heavy defeats and were forced to retreat. The advance into Russian Poland produced a series of catastrophic encounters in which the Austrian forces were nearly destroyed. The intervention of Italy on the Allied side in 1915 opened a new front in the south. The various national groups within the empire began to show signs of the disloyalty that would eventually cause the empire to break apart. Through all of this, Franz Joseph continued his daily routine, working at his desk, signing the various papers that the war required, receiving the various ministers and generals who came to brief him on the situation. He was, by 1915, 85 years old. His vision was failing, his hearing was failing, his physical strength was beginning to decline, but he continued to work day after day with the same patient persistence that had been his lifelong pattern. His final illness began in October of 1916. He had developed by then what his doctors described as a chronic respiratory condition, with frequent coughs and shortness of breath that gradually increased in severity. He continued to work through the illness, sitting at his desk for most of each day, dealing with the papers as best he could. By the middle of November, the illness had progressed to the point where he was confined, more often than not, to bed. He continued to receive the various reports that the war required, but he was no longer able to sign documents reliably, and the senior officials of the imperial government were beginning to make arrangements for the succession. He died on the evening of the 21st of November 1916. He had been at his desk that morning, briefly. He had returned to bed in the afternoon. He had spoken his prayers in the early evening. He had told his valet that he was tired and wanted to sleep. He had closed his eyes. He had not woken again. He was 86 years old. He had been emperor for 68 years. He had been a widower for 18 years. The empire he had spent his life preserving would survive him by less than 2 years, with the final collapse coming in November of 1918, in the chaos that followed the German defeat in the larger war. His funeral in November of 1916 was the last great public ceremony of the Habsburg Empire. The body lay in state in the Hofburg, with thousands of mourners passing through to pay their respects in the days before the funeral. The funeral procession itself moved through the streets of Vienna, with the body in a black-draped hearse, with the various senior figures of the imperial government walking behind. The body was carried into the Capuchin church, where the requiem mass was held, and then into the crypt below, where the sarcophagus was placed in the chamber that already contained the tombs of Sisi and Rudolph. The three of them, husband and wife and son, were now together again, in the cool dark space of the Habsburg burial vault, in the way that Habsburgs had always come together at the end of their lives. The empire ended 2 years later. The Habsburg dynasty was deposed. The various successor states were created from the territory that the empire had ruled. The Hofburg and the Schönbrunn Palace, where Franz Joseph had spent so much of his life, were taken over by the new Republic of Austria. The various imperial residences across the former empire were variously preserved, repurposed, or abandoned. The world that had been the world of Franz Joseph and Sisi, the world of 19th century imperial Vienna, became with surprising speed a world that was definitively gone, with only the buildings and the documents and the memory of the people who had lived in it remaining. Did she love him? I asked the question at the beginning of our story, and now we have walked through the whole story together, and I think we are in a position to consider the question with some seriousness, even if we cannot answer it definitively. She spent most of their marriage trying to be somewhere else. She built her life increasingly around her own travels and her own routines, with him being a fact of her existence rather than a centre of it. She did not provide him with the daily companionship that a marriage normally provides. She arranged for another woman to provide him with that companionship. She wrote her poetry and her letters in ways that suggested her imagination was occupied with other figures and other concerns than her husband. She seems, in much of the surviving evidence, to have viewed him with a kind of fond exasperation rather than with the sustained, passionate attachment that he had for her. The case for saying that she did love him, in some form, is more subtle but worth taking seriously. She returned to him regularly throughout her travels. She did write to him with consistent, if not always intense affection. She did rely on him for the freedom and the resources that his unconditional support gave her, and she would not have relied on him in this way if she had not, at some level, trusted him and cared for him. She arranged the Schrat friendship, which is the act of someone who wanted his happiness even when she could not provide it herself. She mourned him in her way, in the various references to him in her poetry and her letters of the later years. The relationship was real on her side, even if it was not the same as the relationship he had with her. She cared for him as one might care for an old friend who had become, over decades, part of the texture of one's life. The caring was not absent. It was simply different in form from his caring for her. The most complete answer to the question, I think, is that she loved him in a particular way that the simple word love does not quite capture. She loved him with affection, with gratitude, with the kind of long familiarity that makes a person part of one's life even when one is not particularly thinking about them. She did not love him with the romantic intensity that his love for her had. She did not perhaps love him in the way that a wife in a happy marriage loves her husband, but she loved him in some form, and the love was real, and it was simply not the love that he wanted from her. The asymmetry of their feelings was the central fact of the marriage, but the asymmetry was not quite the absence of love on her part. It was the presence of a different kind of love, less intense, less daily, less centered, but real. This is the kind of answer that biographers and historians often arrive at when they look at long marriages from the outside. The simple categories of loved or did not love often turn out to be inadequate to the actual complexity of what people feel for each other over decades. People are complicated. Marriages are complicated. The feelings within a marriage are complicated, particularly when the marriage extends over 44 years. Through births and deaths and political crises and personal transformations and the slow accretion of habits and resentments and small kindnesses that any long relationship produces. The Sisi who married Franz Joseph in 1854 was not the Sisi who returned to him in any given year afterward. The Franz Joseph who waited for her was not always the same Franz Joseph she had left. They were both moving figures, changing through the years, and what they felt for each other changed with them. What I find most affecting about their story, and what I want to leave you with as we draw toward the end of our evening, is the patience of his love for her. He did not get from her what he wanted. He did not get the daily companionship, the warm domestic life, the active emotional engagement that he seems to have hoped for from his marriage. He got instead a wife who was usually somewhere else, who maintained her own preoccupations and her own routines, and who returned to him in the way that travelling friends return periodically rather than intimate partners come home. He accepted this. He did not, in the surviving record, complain. He did not seek to constrain her. He did not punish her for her absences or withdraw his support to bring her back. He simply continued to love her in the patient, direct way that had been his approach from the beginning, and he allowed her to be the person she needed to be, even when that person was not the one his marriage had been intended to give him. There is something almost saintly about this kind of patience. Although Franz Joseph was not by any normal measure a saintly man, he was, by his own account, and by the accounts of those who knew him best, a fairly ordinary middle-aged emperor with conventional opinions and limited imagination, doing his work day after day with the patient devotion of someone who had been told he had to do it, and who had not questioned the assignment. His love for Sisi was, in this respect, of a piece with the rest of his character. He had been told, in 1853, that he was going to love this woman. He had decided, on first sight, that he did love her. He had then continued to love her for the rest of his life in the way that he continued to do everything else he had decided to do, with the unself-conscious persistence of a man for whom the question of whether to continue had simply never seriously arisen. Cute. She, on her side, had a different kind of love story. She had been pulled, at 15, into a life she had not chosen and was not prepared for. She had spent her adult years trying to construct, within the constraints of that life, some space in which she could be herself. The space she constructed was a wandering one, a life of travel and self-management and aesthetic preoccupation that allowed her to exist as a kind of free figure within the structure of her imperial position. The Franz Joseph who had pulled her into the life was also, in some sense, the figure who allowed her to escape from it, by being patient with her absences and supportive of her travels and unconditional in his love. Her relationship with him was, in this respect, complicated in ways that the simple categories of love and not love do not quite capture. He was both the cause of her difficulty and the means of her escape. He was both the husband she had not chosen and the one fixed point in her wandering life. She owed him, in some measure, both her unhappiness and her freedom from unhappiness. The feelings she had for him were correspondingly mixed with gratitude and resentment and affection and regret, all bound up together in ways that no simple sentence could fully describe. The mixture of feeling that defined her relationship to him is, I think, a particularly useful frame for thinking about long marriages in general, even long marriages that are much less famous than this one. Real long marriages. The marriages that last for 40 or 50 years between people who started out without much idea of what they were getting into, developed these kinds of complicated emotional structures over time. The early romantic feelings, if they were there at all, fade or change. The accumulated history of shared experiences, both positive and negative, builds up between the partners. The various accommodations and compromises that any long partnership requires create their own particular textures of obligation and gratitude and resentment. By the time a marriage has lasted 40 years, the feelings within it are rarely the simple feelings of new love. They are, instead, complicated mixtures of various kinds of feeling, with a particular mixture being unique to the particular partnership and not really translatable into the simple categories of romantic love that the early stages of a relationship sometimes allow. The Sisi and Franz Joseph marriage was an extreme case of this kind of complicated long marriage feeling, but the basic pattern is recognizable in many marriages that have lasted as long as theirs did. This is, I think, what their marriage actually was, not a romantic ideal, not the cynical exploitation that some writers have suggested, but a real long marriage, with all the asymmetries and accommodations and slow accumulations of feeling that real long marriages contain. He loved her more than she loved him. He accepted this. She accepted his acceptance. They built, over 44 years, a kind of shared life that worked for both of them in different ways, and that ended only when the violence of the outside world reached in and took her from him. The question I asked at the beginning, did the Empress love her husband, has the answer I have been giving you throughout, which is that she loved him in some form, but not in the form that he loved her, and that the form she loved him in was complicated and qualified, and not always present in her daily thoughts. This is, I suspect, the most honest answer that the historical record can support. It is not the romantic answer. It is the answer that careful attention to the surviving evidence produces, and it is the answer that I think fits what we know about how long marriages between very different people actually work. What stays with me when I think about their story is the image of him at his desk, in the small office at the Hofburg or at Schönbrunn, writing his daily letter to her wherever she happened to be. He had been doing this for decades. He had filled hundreds of pages with the small details of his daily life and the small expressions of his affection. He had sealed the letters and sent them to whatever forwarding address her travels currently required. He had received her letters back, less frequent and less intense than his own, and he had kept them carefully as he had kept everything that came from her. The desk and the letters and the patient writing are, for me, the central image of his love for her. Not the grand gestures, not the public ceremonies, not the imperial displays of affection, just the daily writing, year after year, decade after decade, the patient correspondence of a man who had decided, at 23, to love this woman, and who continued to love her until the day she died. The image of the desk is worth lingering on for a moment because it captures something about the texture of his life that the more dramatic moments of the story do not capture. Most of his 68 years on the throne were spent at that desk. The dramatic moments, the diplomatic crises and the wars and the assassinations and the deaths in the family were the exceptions. The rule was the desk. He filled his life with the ordinary working tasks of his position, with very little personal indulgence and very little time for himself. The letters to Sisi were, in this respect, one of the few personal activities that he allowed himself in the long working days. They were, in a sense, his real life, the part of his life that he was choosing to do for himself rather than for the empire, and they were, throughout the marriage, addressed to her. Imagine him for a moment on an ordinary winter evening in the 1880s. The evening papers have been signed. The various officials who had audiences with him through the day have gone. The household staff have brought him his simple supper, which he has eaten alone at the small table in the corner of his office. The candles have been lit. The fire in the small fireplace has been built up. He is settled at his desk with a fresh sheet of writing paper and a fountain pen. Sisi is somewhere far away, in Madeira or in Corfu or in some other distant location, and he is going to write her a letter before he goes to bed. He thinks for a moment about what he wants to say. He begins to write. The letter is not eloquent. He was never an eloquent writer. The letter is direct, simple, unadorned. He tells her about the weather. He asks after her health. He hopes she is feeling better. He hopes the climate where she is staying is suiting her. He thinks of her often, particularly in the quiet hours of the evening when he has finished his work. He misses her. He sends his love. He signs the letter. He folds it. He seals it with the imperial seal. He places it in the box where the outgoing imperial correspondence is collected for the morning's dispatch. He returns to his desk for a few more minutes of paperwork before bed. He goes to bed. He sleeps. He wakes the next morning at 4:30 and begins the same routine again. The letter, by the time he is at his desk for the next day's work, is on its way to wherever Sisi happens to be, with the imperial couriers who handled such correspondence delivering it within a few days to her current location. This was the texture of his marriage to her, not the dramatic moments of the historical record, but the patient daily writing of letters, year after year, decade after decade, addressed to a woman who was usually somewhere else, with the consistency of feeling that defined his approach to everything else in his life. The desk, the pen, the simple letters, the seal, the dispatch box, the waiting for the response, the reading of the response when it came, the careful preservation of all of her letters in his own files, where they would be found after his death in the careful order in which he had kept them. This was what loving her, in his way, actually consisted of. This was what he did throughout the marriage, to maintain the connection that the practical separations of their daily lives might otherwise have broken. The question of whether she loved him is, in a sense, less important than the simple fact of his love for her. His love was real. It was sustained. It was unconditional. It was, in its quiet and unspectacular way, one of the longer and more patient love affairs of 19th century European history. Whether she returned it in the same form or in a different complicated form or in no form at all, the love itself was there, on his side, and the thing that gave their marriage its particular shape. I have one final thought to leave you with, before we say goodnight. The Sisi who was assassinated in Geneva in 1898, the Sisi who has come down to us through history, is in many ways a difficult figure to like. She was self-absorbed. She was demanding. She neglected her duties. She was sometimes cruel, in small ways, to people who depended on her. She was an ambivalent mother to most of her children, an absent wife to her husband, a dilettante in her various artistic and intellectual pursuits. The romantic picture of her that has come down to us through legend does not really survive contact with the historical record. The real Sisi was, in many ways, a less appealing person than the legendary Sisi, but she was also, in her way, doing the best she could with a situation she had not chosen and was not equipped to manage. She had been pulled into the imperial life at 15, with no preparation, and she had spent the rest of her life trying to make some kind of life work within that frame. The travels, the regimens, the poetry, the various preoccupations that filled her days were all attempts at managing a position that the original arrangement had not really allowed her to manage. She failed in many ways. She did not, in the end, become the kind of empress that her position demanded, but she did in her own way survive, and she did construct some kind of meaningful existence for herself, and she did this in the face of pressures that would have broken many other people, and she deserves at least this much credit for what she made of an extraordinarily difficult situation. It is worth thinking about for a moment what her life might have been if she had not married Franz Joseph in 1854. If Sophie's original plan had succeeded and Helene had been the candidate, Sisi would have stayed in Bavaria, would have eventually married some lesser nobleman, would have lived the kind of quiet country aristocratic life that her sisters and her cousins lived. She would not have become famous. She would not have been celebrated for her beauty across Europe. She would not have written her poetry in the volumes that have been preserved. She would almost certainly have been happier than she was as the Empress of Austria. The price of her historical visibility was, in some sense, unhappiness. The fact that we know about her at all is the fact that her marriage was difficult enough, and her response to that difficulty distinctive enough, that she became one of the most discussed female figures of 19th century European royalty. The ordinary happy life that she might have lived would have produced no surviving record beyond the routine genealogies of the Bavarian aristocracy. The unhappy famous life she did lead has produced libraries of biography and analysis. The historical record itself is, in this respect, a kind of memorial to her difficulty. Her husband, Franz Joseph, did not have her temperament and could not have constructed her kind of life even if he had wanted to. He had, instead, his own approach to the same difficulties. He worked, he maintained the routines, he fulfilled the duties. He carried the empire forward year after year, decade after decade, with the same patient persistence that he brought to his marriage. He did not, in the end, save the empire. The forces that destroyed it were larger than any one ruler could have managed, but he did his work, for as long as he was able to do it, and he died at his desk in the middle of the war that would prove the work had not been enough. He too deserves at least this much credit for what he made of an extraordinarily difficult situation. The two of them, taken together, give us one of the more interesting case studies of what a long royal marriage actually looked like in the 19th century. Not the romantic ideal of the popular imagination, not the cold political alliance of the cynical imagination, but something in between, something more complicated, something that the simple categories cannot quite contain. They were married for 44 years. They had 4 children together, 3 of whom survived to adulthood. They lived through political crises, personal tragedies, the slow transformation of the empire from a traditional dynastic state to a modern multi-ethnic polity that was struggling to hold itself together. They aged together, although mostly apart. They died years apart, with him outliving her by nearly 2 decades, but with their tombs eventually placed together in the family vault. Their marriage was one of the central facts of European royal history in the second half of the 19th century. And the question of what that marriage was, what it meant, what they felt for each other within it, is a question worth spending time on, even now, more than a century after the last of them was lowered into the Capuchin crypt. Together, the two of them lived through one of the most interesting marriages of the 19th century. They lived through it without ever quite understanding each other, without ever quite getting from each other what they wanted, without ever quite resolving the asymmetry of feeling that had been present from the beginning. But they lived through it for 44 years, and they remained connected to each other through all of it. And at the end, when the violence of an anarchist's blade took her from him, he said the simple sentence that summed up what he had felt for her throughout. "You do not know how much I loved this woman." He had loved her. That was the truth of his life. And in the end, it is perhaps the most important truth that any of us can leave behind. The night is late. The story is finished. I hope you have found some rest in it, whether you have followed every word or only some of them, whether you have stayed awake throughout or drifted off at some point along the way. The question I asked at the beginning, did the Empress love her husband, has been answered as well as I can answer it, which is to say imperfectly, with qualifications and ambiguities, in the way that questions about real human feelings between real people generally have to be answered. She loved him in some form. He loved her without qualification. The marriage worked, after a fashion, for 44 years. They are both long dead now, with the empire they ruled gone, and the courts they presided over reduced to museums and historical sites. The question of what they felt for each other is still there, in the surviving letters and the surviving diaries and the surviving accounts, for anyone who wants to spend the time to look. The lives of 19th century imperial figures are, in some ways, easier to think about than the lives of ordinary people from the same period. The imperial figures left more documents, they were observed by more witnesses, they were photographed and painted and written about in greater detail. We can know them, in the limited way that we can know any historical figure, more thoroughly than we can know the ordinary inhabitants of the same period whose lives went unrecorded. The Sisi and Franz Joseph who come down to us are, in this respect, particularly well-known historical figures, with the surviving record allowing us to ask the kinds of questions about their inner lives that we could not ask about most of their contemporaries. The question I have been asking tonight, did she love him, is a question that we can ask of them in a way we could not ask it of the ordinary aristocratic couples of the period whose marriages went undocumented. The privilege of knowing them, in the way that historical attention allows us to know them, is one of the rewards of the long study of 19th century European history. The reward is partial, qualified, complicated by the various biases of the surviving record, but it is real, and it is one of the things that makes their story worth attending to, even from this distance, even with all the changes that the intervening century and a quarter has produced. The Capuchin crypt where they lie is open to visitors today. It is a small underground space in the center of Vienna, with rows of bronze and copper sarcophagi arranged through the various chambers. The chamber where Sisi and Rudolf and Franz Joseph lie together is one of the busier ones, with tourists passing through every day to look at the tombs. The visitors stand and read the inscriptions and take their photographs and pass on. The three of them, mother and son and husband, lie quietly in their tombs, while this happens, undisturbed by the daily attention of the visitors, with the bronze of their sarcophagi gradually darkening through the decades, with the small flowers that visitors sometimes leave gradually accumulating on the floor between the tombs. They have been there for over a century now. They will, presumably, be there for a great many more centuries, in the cool, quiet space that has been the burial place of the Habsburgs since the 17th century. The world they ruled is gone. The world that has replaced it has its own concerns. But they lie together, the three of them, in the quiet vault, in the way that families have always lain together at the end of their lives, in the long silence that follows all the noise of any human existence. There is something about a burial vault, particularly an old one, that has its own particular quality. The Capuchin crypt has been receiving the Habsburgs for over 3 centuries. Generation after generation of the family has been brought down into the underground chambers and placed in the elaborate sarcophagi that the family commissioned for each of its dead. The crypt has, in this respect, accumulated the weight of those 3 centuries of imperial death, with each chamber containing the various relatives of the various imperial figures whose lives shaped the history of Central Europe. The visitors who come to see the famous tombs, the tombs of Sisi and Rudolf and Franz Joseph, walk past dozens of less famous tombs, of imperial figures whose names are barely remembered now, who lived and died, and were buried here in the same way that the more famous figures eventually were. The crypt is, in its way, a kind of meditation on the universality of death and the particular obscurity into which all but the most famous historical figures eventually fade, but all of them, famous and less famous alike, contain the same kind of remains in the same quiet underground space, with the same long silence eventually settling over all of them. The various places where Sisi and Franz Joseph spent their lives have by now become museums and tourist sites. The Hofburg in Vienna is open to visitors, with the imperial apartments preserved as they were in their final period of use. The Schönbrunn Palace, where Franz Joseph died in 1916, is one of the most visited tourist sites in Austria, with thousands of visitors passing through its rooms every day during the summer months. The Aquileion on Corfu, the Greek villa that Sisi built and then sold, is also open to visitors, with the gardens and the principal rooms preserved as a museum of 19th century imperial taste. Bad Ischl, where they met in 1853, is still a small Austrian town with the Kaiser Villa preserved as a historical site. Geneva has a small monument near the spot where Sisi was attacked in 1898. Mayerling, where Rudolf died, has been converted into a Carmelite convent, with the rooms where the deaths took place transformed into a chapel for the prayers of the nuns. The various locations of their lives are, in this respect, all preserved, all visitable, all open to the slow tourism that has become one of the principal ways in which we now engage with the historical past. What the visitors get when they visit these places is a kind of physical proximity to the lives that were lived there, with the rooms and the gardens and the views remaining as they were when the original inhabitants were using them. The proximity is, in some ways, deceptive. The rooms are quiet now. The gardens are kept by professional gardeners according to schedules that the original inhabitants did not establish. The views are the same views that the original inhabitants saw, but they are looked at by visitors who do not see them the way the original inhabitants did. The buildings are real. The lives that were lived in them are gone. The visitors come, in some sense, to bridge this gap, to use their own imagination to populate the empty rooms with the figures who once filled them. Whether the imagination succeeds or fails depends partly on the visitor and partly on the building. The Hofburg apartments do not, on the whole, succeed in conjuring up Franz Joseph, who was so quiet and so plain in his daily existence that the rooms cannot really show what his life was like. The Achillean on Corfu, with its over-the-top Greek revival decoration, succeeds rather better at conjuring up Sisi, whose life had a similar quality of imaginative excess that the building captures. This is what we are left with when the historical figures themselves are gone. The buildings, the documents, the various physical traces of the lives that were lived. The rest is reconstruction, imagination, the patient work of biographers and historians, and the occasional filmmakers and novelists who try to bring the past back to life. None of this fully succeeds. The past is past and we cannot fully reach it. But we can, with sufficient attention and sufficient patience, get closer to it than the bare facts of the historical record might suggest. And the closer we get, the more interesting the figures from the past become. Sisi and Franz Joseph, in this respect, are particularly interesting figures because the surviving record allows us to get unusually close to them, with their letters and their poems and their personal possessions all preserved and available for those who want to look. We can know them, in some sense, more intimately than we can know most historical figures. The intimacy is partial and qualified, but it is there, and it is one of the reasons that their story continues to interest people more than a century after both of them have died. The day is over, the night is yours. Whatever questions of your own you brought to this evening, you can put them down for now and let them rest. They will be there in the morning if you need them. For now, just rest, sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one.